Make sure that we have audio. We do. Okay. Welcome to the Clean Room, Controlled Environment for Uncontrolled Conversation Book Club on Cynical Theories, Part 2, Chapters 2 and 3. Chapter 2 is called Postmodernism's Applied Turn, which I'm thinking is going to be a pretty useless chapter like last time. And no offense to the authors or anything. It's just I don't think we're going to have a useful conversation about that chapter. We'll see. And then chapter 3 seems to be the first chapter where they really get into the specifics of their problems with what's happening in academia, and it's called Post-colonialism. And again, Sam is with me today, and a bunch of other people are here. If you want to participate, go to the Discord. Let me or somebody in there know, because I'm going to have to enable your audio. There are some new rules this time, because last time I was not at all happy with last time. I didn't think it was a very good episode, and I felt like it was too chaotic, and I was thinking about what we could do about that. So what we've done this time is from this point forward, when Sam is going to discuss, he's going to talk about what some section in the book. And we're not going to talk until he opens it up for discussion, and then we'll talk. And I'm going to try to keep the conversation on what Sam just was talking about. We're not going to go off topic there if we can help it. I'll allow a little bit of swaying because it is a topic that touches many things, and there might be some side discussion necessary, but I'm going to try to keep it back focused. And if it goes on too long, I'm not doing another 4-hour stream. So if it starts to go on too long and we're not moving, I'm going to just say, okay, that's enough. You guys can talk about this later. So, yeah, Sam, ready?
Yeah. Let's get into it. So, Chapter 2, Postmodernism's Applied Turn. The subtitle is Making Oppression Real. So we get the authors telling us in the beginning of this chapter, giving a sort of recap of chapter 1 about postmodernism, and they say, look, like this original version of high deconstructive postmodernism was sort of doomed to just deconstruct and deconstruct and deconstruct without really having a clear political goal, or without really having anything constructive or productive to build on after it deconstructed everything, including itself, they say. So it was fated to become boring. And this is one of the problems I had with this chapter, was the way that the authors sort of tell us how to think about this genealogy that they're sketching, rather than sort of leaving the interpretation of the development of the ideas a little bit more open-ended. So I have this quote from my friend Oliver Traldi's review of the book that I thought captured this pretty well. So I'm going to read that. Traldi writes, "Why did postmodernism enter its second phase in the 1980s? When it comes to the why of these developments in recent intellectual history, the authors might have been better off not saying much. In one place they write, endless dismantling and disruption is fated to consume everything interesting and thus render itself boring. That is, theory, capital T, couldn't content itself with nihilistic despair. It needed something to do, something actionable. Because of its own morally and politically charged core, it had to apply itself to the problem it saw at the core of society, unjust access to power." End quote of the authors. Traldi goes on, "Surely Pluckrose and Lindsay don't literally mean that postmodernism is the sort of thing that can be bored or discontented, but just what they do mean isn't really clear. They go on to say, we therefore might think of postmodernism as a kind of fast-evolving virus. Its original and purest form was unsustainable. It tore its hosts apart and destroyed itself." End quote. I don't think that sheds much light on things either, and in general I become wary when writers start proposing ways for me to think rather than making explicit arguments towards conclusions. So that's Traldi's, the excerpt from Oliver Traldi's review. And I think that captures a serious problem, and that there's just this sort of encouragement, but not so much encouragement, rather than just sort of dictation of the way that we should think about this as a virus. And I'm not sure how substantive this is, but I felt it was worth sharing to open it up and see what other people thought about this sort of virus narrative.
Eric's trying to. There we go. He's in now. Should be unmuted, right? You can talk. He has a server mute on him, but I didn't do that. You don't have you don't
Eric is communicating very well.
Yeah, you don't have a mute on this channel. But when I right click on your name, it says you've been muted on the server. So I didn't do that. I don't know what we can do about that. I'll reach out to Cyborg and see if he can get that fixed.
Cyborg. Anyone else have any thoughts? I'm sure Eric can, once we get him unmuted, he can let us know what he thinks about this.
I'm sure he will.
So is the problem that they're like humanizing something that's inhuman, kind of like they're adding personality where there's no personality to an ideology?
Yeah, that's a succinct way of putting the problem that I have with it. I can understand why, like if you were making a movie about this you might want to like personify postmodernism as a virus, and then like it could be like the supervillain of the film or something. But for a book that's supposed to be giving like a serious analysis of the history of postmodern thought, how it has sort of manifested in the scholarship and activism that today poses the most serious threat, I don't think that this sort of thing is useful, and it suggests a kind of totalizing where it's not very appropriate. And I think that that's related to the point that I'll focus on, which is the conflation between postmodernism and critical theory. Because I think that to say that postmodernism was doomed to become too boring to be attractive or politically actionable, if it was too boring, and then the sort of response was to make it explicitly political and to have an explicit moral and political agenda, then it seems to me you've departed from postmodernism so far that you're not really talking about applied postmodernism, right? Because if one of the crucial themes of postmodernism is supposed to be cultural relativism, then postmodernism can't have an explicit moral and political agenda. It's explicitly supposed to be relative to the context in which it's applied. So that seems like a problem. It seems to me that a lot more of the applied postmodernism, as they are describing it here, would be better described as a sort of offshoot of critical theory, which they say to some extent later on that it is informed by critical theory. But if it is so informed by critical theory as to make political and moral purposes central, whereas postmodernism is supposed to be infused with this cultural relativism, I don't understand how this is applied postmodernism. It seems to me much more of just a sort of subdiscipline specific offshoot of for school tradition.
I'm losing you, Sam. I think your connection's slow.
So yeah. Shit! Did you hear what I?
It was
said?
just
Did I make
just
a
like
coherent
the last
point?
like the last like 5 seconds. It was no big deal.
Okay. Yeah. So I just basically, I'm not sure how. They have a quote. They say on page 48, during its applied turn, theory underwent a moral mutation. It adopted a number of beliefs about the rights and wrongs of power and privilege. This seems straightforwardly inconsistent with cultural relativism. And it seems a lot more like critical theory at its core than postmodernism. So that's the basic point there.
Ugh.
Have thoughts on that?
I'm just trying to fix the permission settings on the channel, so I apologize.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. I can chip in.
There we go.
No, I've been able to unmute for a while. I think last time you made it clear that you don't necessarily accept like the meme theory of knowledge that is more viral will survive and replicate, just as we see in speciation. But Reed in the YouTube chat points out that there is a paper from Hypatia that's titled "Women's Studies as Virus." So clearly, there's some desire for not only do the ideas that we're going to hear about are going to be viral, but there's some explicit naming on the part of one of the primary feminist journals in one of its papers that women's studies may in ways intentionally be viral. So I don't know. It seems kind of neutral to describe it as a virus. Like I would just expect ideas that replicate to be viruses. I mean, I can't tell whether you guys like whether the plan is to summarize before criticizing, or whether you want to like criticize as we go, or like what's the plan?
Trying to keep it onto discussions about what Sam was just talking about. So I was only half paying attention because I was trying to make sure you could talk. So I can't really speak to it right now.
I mean, I'll try to summarize the points relevant to my critiques, and as we will see in the next chapter, actually, not only critiques. I have some agreements with the authors in the next chapter. But I'll try to summarize as we go, like as is necessary for the points that I'm making. So I guess I don't think I made the point as clear as I would have optimally. So the point about, it being fated to become boring, we get on pages 45 to 46, at the bottom of 45, spilling over to 46. They say, because of its own morally and politically charged core, it, here being postmodernism, it had to apply itself to the problem it saw at the core of society, unjust access to power. So they're saying that that postmodernism has a morally and politically charged core here, which, as we talked about last time, I objected to. But then on page 48, they say, during its applied turn, theory underwent a moral mutation and adopted a number of beliefs about the rights and wrongs of power and privilege. So that just seems inconsistent to me, right? Like, is it the case that postmodernism has a moral and political core, or does it not, and it underwent this moral mutation? Which one is it, right? And I think the one that makes more sense to me is the idea that it did actually have this moral mutation, right? The high deconstructionists were limited in their ability to actually apply their theories to moral and political purposes. And so in order to be politically actionable, it had to evolve in this sense, right? But my point that I was trying to make was the evolution is so far of a departure from some of the core values that they assign to postmodernism, namely, specifically cultural relativism, that putting something moral and political at the core sort of undermines the extent to which we can appropriately call it postmodernism. And it seems to me much more like applied critical theory. But I don't think that this is of...
I have
Sorry, go ahead.
a comment on that. So, I mean, I agree it's applied critical theory, but they're using postmodernism as a tool to sort of... They're using the sort of viral nature of postmodernism. It is a very viral like idea. It gets into your head when you start thinking that way in terms of deconstructing things and not assuming anything and sort of the resistance to meta narrative sort of. So like you can see why maybe you would think, well, I grew up in the West, and so I have a certain idea about how things are. And I think you would agree with me that postmodernism would say, well, that doesn't mean I can say anything necessarily about how other people who didn't grow up in would that be accurate according to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, except if the postmodernist wants to say that, like, I can say one thing, that like societies are socially constructed, and however they did grow up is going to be a product of their socialization and blah blah blah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in agreement with you that like the postmodernists who we discussed last time probably wouldn't like this approach because it is taking a moral stance on
Yeah.
It is specifically. Now, my argument last time and continues into this time is that you can't get rid of a meta narrative because it creates a void where one will fill. So the idea of getting rid of becomes one. And I would say, to me, that's what critical theory is doing. It is saying, it is taking the idea of pulling things apart and not assuming anything about how good something is, and using it to sort of, on one end, just pull apart the norm, the West, or where we're coming from. Like these people are not coming out of other places in the world for the most part. They're in Western academia, so like they are pulling apart their own culture in a way. Even if they came from somewhere else, they're here now. So they're pulling apart their own culture, and for me, it seems like critical theory adds on the whole oppressor versus oppressed idea, but it uses postmodernism to destroy and take apart the perceived oppressor, and then uses another thing to put it abandons postmodernism when it starts upholding the oppressed as better.
I agree with all of that. My point would just be, because that makes much more sense to me than it makes much more sense to me to say that these applied theories that they spend the next 5 chapters of the book on are applied critical theories that sort of take from the postmodern toolbox when necessary, with the main exception being queer theory, where it's like very clearly more postmodern than critical. But it would make more sense to me for the genealogy to be, look, critical theory is sort of the main constant here, and tools from the postmodernist toolbox are used selectively when they can be put to good use for the purposes of critical theory as relevant in this discipline, whether it's post-colonial or critical race theory or feminist studies or anything like that. So to just make critical theory central, and to make it such that they're taking from the postmodern toolbox rather than vice versa, which is how it is in the book.
Okay. I mean, I think I half agree with you, but I think part of what you're saying sounds like, well, the guys who figured out how to harness the power of the atom were really just trying to harness the power of the atom, and nuclear weapons are just, that's something else. It feels a little bit like you are responsible for how people use the tools that you create, especially if they're very powerful. So that's where I'm a little resistant to it in the way that I don't think the postmodernists are completely free from blame. I think that they because they are the ones who made these, like, I would argue, very dangerous tools, useful to people who are not helping society, and using it in ways that they themselves, I think, would say are sort of not what they wanted. I would think that postmodernists would want to take a strong stand against what is being done with their theory, and the lack of that. And I think there's a difficulty for somebody who labels themselves a postmodernist to say that's wrong, because that itself would be a meta narrative. To say, to use our theory in the way you are using it goes against is a wrong thing to do, it becomes a sort of meta narrative of it becomes a moral judgment in a way.
I guess I wasn't. I didn't mean to comment on
Eric, you're muted if
whether
you're
these
talking.
thinkers are like blameworthy or anything like that. Like didn't mean to enter into that territory about like I don't think them if they were to instead center critical theory rather than the postmodernists and to say that these offshoots are in their core more critical than postmodernist. I wasn't trying to comment on like whether the original critical theorists are like more or less to blame than the postmodernists or anything like that. I think that I mean it's an interesting moral question about the responsibility one has for the ideas one puts out into the world, but I feel like talking about that goes a little too far from our purposes here in the book club.
I think there are a couple questions, which is, so one, I think we have to end up asking whether, I mean, I think there's a degree to which Lindsay and Pluckrose don't make it clear, but a degree to which postmodernism is itself self-contradictory in its doubt of meta-narratives. It creates a meta-narrative of doubt. So, like, it runs into similar problems that, someone like a positivist would run into in their sort of declarations about truth. But, I mean, I think the thesis of the book, and, I could be wrong, perhaps they could make it clear that they think critical theory is heavily influenced by postmodernism rather than a direct offshoot of it. But I think in the next few chapters, they managed to demonstrate that some of these theorists cite postmodern thinkers enough to demonstrate that they seem to at times consider themselves to be offshoots of postmodernism. Whether or not we identify all of the themes as consistently in their work as Lindsay and Pluckrose claim are in their work. I think setting up the genealogy is part of their thesis. I don't think it's necessarily the core of their thesis. Yeah.
I pretty much agree. I want to, Sam, if you want to respond to that, Chris said something in the chat I would like to respond to, but all right, I'll respond to Chris. So
I definitely think. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I definitely think that they point to a lot of these people citing Pluckers and Lindley point to, like, for instance, Kimberly Crenshaw in her work on intersectionality, explicitly stating that she's influenced by postmodernism and that the concept of intersectionality is like an effort to marry contemporary politics with postmodern theory. And there are others, right? Like Judith Butler, it's obvious that Butler is like an offshoot of Derrida and Foucault. And like she, like, if anyone of the applied postmodernists is a postmodernist rather than a critical theorist, I think Judith Butler is a clear example. But I mean, I haven't read enough of the theorists to see like the extent to which the tradition they're working in is shaped by postmodernism rather than by critical theorists. It's true that they point to them citing postmodernists, but we don't know, because they don't make an effort to point out whenever they're citing critical theorists. We don't really have a way to adjudicate, at least given the context of the book. But it's a good point.
All right, do we want to move on to the next?
What was Chris's point?
He was disagreeing with me on saying that postmodernism has some hand in this because they created the tools that are being used, and he was basically saying then we could say Marx is to blame for Stalinism, and I would say, well, for me, Stalinism, after Stalinism, we should at least acknowledge Marx's hand in that and think maybe we should not take this, maybe this isn't a great idea. Maybe there's some problems with this. And then he said, or blame Nietzsche for Hitlerism, but I think the Nietzsche stuff that's Hitler is very much not Nietzsche. the fact that he didn't want to.
Well, the Nietzsche that leads to postmodernism is very much Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche
That's
said
true.
there are no facts, only interpretations.
That's true. I mean, my favorite philosopher is also very much like that. Sam and I are gonna have our big debate on truth someday, but
One day.
it'll happen.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean that again, it's not. It reminds me of last week in terms of like, it's a bit of quibbling over details that in the long run might not make too much not make too much of a difference to their overall thesis. But insofar as the overall thesis does sort of depend on the genealogy a bit, and their point in the book is not that critical theory has given us this scholarship, but that really postmodernism has. I think it is a bit more relevant than, whether they get Rawls right, for instance, where I admit I pressed on a little where it was unnecessary.
Do you think that critical theory would be effective as it has been to disrupt Western, especially the academy, without postmodernism?
I mean, I think it's totally plausible that it could. Marx, like, why do people who are at least academic Marxists nowadays call themselves academic Marxists? Is it because Marx gave us like an awesome blueprint for communism? No, because he didn't. It's because of his critiques of capitalism. And there's really like no motivation for the sort of socialist or communist utopia unless you have all of the criticisms of capitalism first, which Marx was happy to provide. So I think that the deconstruction, I mean, it might not have been called deconstruction as it is so often with the postmodernists, but it wasn't so much of an invention. It was just, I mean, for instance, Foucault was just applying it to much more specific institutions than Marx. I mean, Marx was focused on the economy and the political structure governing societies, whereas Foucault was looking at for like mental institutions and prisons and academic disciplines, right? So it's not so much of an innovation as a sort of just refocusing of the lens, in my view.
It's fair. I don't see it that way, but it's fair. I still see it as like, I don't know. Part of me wonders how much of it is critical theory using postmodernism, and how much of it is postmodernists who realize that they can't actually accomplish anything without something like critical theory. But I mean, I guess you do get into a no true Scotsman discussion, because does a true postmodernist not have goals? Does not have like ideas for how society should be shaped?
Yeah, right. I don't want to get into that.
No,
like, I don't want to answer your question.
No, don't. I wasn't asking.
Yeah,
I was only asking
right.
it to illustrate where my mind is at,
Yeah.
not to push you.
On the top of page
So-
47, I had written, are Lindsay and Pluckrose contradictory, or is theory? Because in the first chapter at the top of page, or I'm sorry, in the first paragraph at the top of page 47, they outline some ideas about theory that are contradictory, that objective reality cannot be known, but we must expose and disrupt political power dynamics that are baked into discourses. So there are assumptions about what's true, and yet objective reality can't be known. So I took this to be that Lindsay and Pluckrose are claiming theory is contradictory. Perhaps they're a little poor at pointing out some of the like areas where they think it's explicitly contradictory, but in some ways that sort of resolves some of the concerns about whether postmodernism is truly like value free or morally relativistic.
Right. And so they at least helpfully make it clear when we get to their deeper analysis of applied postmodernism as they see it, that the core postmodern principles sort of remain the same with the crucial exception, right? Like objective reality cannot be known with the crucial exception that we know objectively that oppression exists, right? And that oppression is like based on identity categories or something like that. So they give a consistent or a reading on which it's at least self-consistent for the applied postmodernists to say what they're saying. They say, look, I'm not saying objective reality can't be known. I'm saying only this part of objective reality can be known, or whatever. Yeah. So
I had a different take.
then,
Sorry, I'll wait till you're finished.
oh, what? No, go ahead. What was it?
Well, this is probably more from my religious beliefs than anything, but the way I see it, what postmodernism did would be like if you went into a tribe that was very, very reliant on a certain narrative, meta-narrative, whatever you want to call it, and you just obliterated it and then expected them not to just find a new one to latch onto. And I don't think that would happen. I think that when you obliterate the meta-narrative that keeps society together, other ones will come up, and it will be very dangerous because the void left by that attack is going to suck so hard that opportunists are going to use that situation. And that's where I blame postmodernism and I don't think that it was intentional. So like the question of intent kind of comes up, but
right. I just
Eric
my
totally
difficulty with that
me.
is it suggests that like before the postmodern right, so it suggests that the story goes something like this, right? There is this view of society, and then the postmodernists deconstructed everything, and then something had to fill in the void once the meta-narrative of modernism, I guess, was deconstructed, or even once postmodernism like ate itself, right? And then something came in to fill the void, and in different disciplines, these were different things. In post-colonialism, it was that like the West constructed the East in opposition to itself in order for the West to see itself as superior. In critical race theory, you get that like oppression, like that systemic racism is real, and it's not like abnormal, like it's very common in societies. My problem is like each of the marginalized or oppressed groups that went on to like found these subdisciplines had already been thinking about things this way, or at least that there were already traditions of thinking about things this way. Like the idea of systemic racism didn't arise and become popularly accepted in the Black community because like postmodernism deconstructed anything. Like this has been around. Institutional racism was coined in I think 1969 in a book called Black Power, and like these ideas had been around for long. So it doesn't seem to me that like critical race theory was like the idea that you enter a tribe and then you tell the tribe that its founding spiritual principles are incorrect, and then so something else has to fill the void. The analogy to me doesn't work because the use of postmodernism that each of these subdisciplines or disciplines found, the way that they found postmodernism useful was for pretty specific purposes, given the already accepted, like intuitively obvious to them, or at least to many within their communities, right? They're not homogenous. To many within their communities that, for instance, systemic racism is real and structures Black people's lives in certain ways, or that homophobia is real and structures gay and lesbian and trans people's lives in certain ways, or whatever.
Yeah.
I don't want to get lost in the weeds repeatedly here because it sounds like we're just having a general discussion about whether there's a religion-shaped hole in the human soul and whether another religion-shaped meta-narrative has to fill it, or whether humans are meaning-making devices in order to better predict their surroundings and make meanings out of things that allow them to better predict what's going to happen, like threats from predators, which give them greater survival value. We can get lost in that, but we've gone 2 pages, guys.
Yeah. Fair.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. Okay. Let's see. Yeah. So because I want to have more time for chapter 3, I'm gonna skip over some stuff that I was gonna point out, just things that I thought were uncharitable or unfair. So I'll get to something where I think that actually is more relevant. On page 56, when they're talking about bell hooks. So let's see. Just in terms of like setting the stage a little bit, they're just discussing like the different disciplines that arose that they're going to call applied postmodernism. So we have postcolonial theory, we have queer theory, we have critical race theory and intersectionality, we have feminist theory and gender studies, and then we have disability studies and fat studies. I think that was all of them. And they're describing the sort of evolution as it took place as certain theorists, like Edward Said, I think his first name was Edward, right? Edward Said in postcolonial theory, Judith Butler in queer theory, and they talk about bell hooks in black feminism, which influenced both critical race theory and feminist theory in the future. So they talk about this essay that bell hooks wrote called Postmodern Blackness. And I hadn't read it before today, but I decided, at first I was like, you know what, I'm just going to allow that they give a good exposition of bell hooks. I'm just going to trust the authors here. But I found a copy of it and I decided to read it. And there are some things that I found just clearly wrong with the exposition of her position and her influence. So on top of page 66, page 56, they say, for Hooks, the problem was not that postmodernism was useless, it was that it was tailored to the experiences of white male intellectuals and did not allow for identity politics. Hooks claimed that postmodern thought erred in destabilizing the concept of identity, which led it to exclude the unified voices and experiences of Black Americans, particularly Black women, and their aspirations to disrupt dominant narratives for the purposes of pursuing racial equality. So, particularly their claim that Hooks said that postmodern thought erred in destabilizing the concept of identity, which led it to exclude the unified voices and experiences of Black Americans. So they have that claim, which suggests that she's saying that she's sort of on the side of essentialist thinking about Blackness, for example, or about identity categories in general, that there is this unified experience that all Black people are familiar with simply by virtue of being Black in an anti-Black society or something like that. And so I have a couple of quotes here from the actual essay by bell hooks. And she says,
which essay is this again?
Postmodern is called Postmodern Blackness. And you can find it pretty easily on the internet. I couldn't find the actual one with the page numbers that they're using because that comes from a reader that I couldn't find. But so one thing that, so right after that statement I just read from Pluckrose and Lindsay comes after they cite this quote from Hooks. Should we not be suspicious of postmodern critiques of the subject when they surface at a historical moment when many subjugated people feel themselves coming to voice for the first time? But then in the next paragraph, she says, postmodern critiques of essentialism which challenge notions of universality and static, overdetermined identity within mass culture and mass consciousness, can open up new possibilities for the construction of self and the assertion of agency. So here she's actually praising postmodern anti-essentialism, or just anti-essentialism as informed by postmodernism. And she says, employing a critique of essentialism allows African Americans to acknowledge the way in which class mobility has altered collective Black experience, so that racism does not necessarily have the same impact on our lives. Such a critique allows us to affirm multiple Black identities, varied Black experience. It also challenges colonial imperialist paradigms of Black identity, which blah, blah, blah. So she goes on to make it very clear that she is not a fan of essentialist thinking about race, whereas the authors paint her as objecting to postmodernism on the grounds that it does not allow for the unified voices and experiences of Black Americans.
It seemed like their prior quote of Hooks was much more relevant to their claim that Hooks rejects postmodernism for not allowing for identity politics based on a radical Black subjectivity. Hooks says, which they quote on page 55, and I'm curious if you found this in your essay. Hooks says, the postmodern critique of identity, though relevant for renewed Black liberation struggle, is often posed in ways that are problematic. Given a pervasive politic of white supremacy which seeks to prevent the formation of radical Black subjectivity, we cannot cavalierly dismiss a concern with identity politics. That seems to be where they're drawing their specific claim about Hooks wanted to tailor postmodernism to identity politics and dismiss its white origins.
But if you read the rest of the essay that comes right after where those quotes come from, that's where you get the stuff that I was just saying. So the way that Hooks' essay is structured is like, look, there are these problems with postmodernism as it's sort of manifested thus far. Like, it hasn't allowed for application to specifically Black issues, and it's like excluded Black people, right? Or not enough Black people have participated in the theorization itself. And so there are these problems, but then we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss postmodernism. It actually has useful resources for us given X, Y, and Z, where one of the reasons she gives is that essentialism actually is bad and is an oversimplified way to look at it, right? If the idea is that identity politics, so she she's optimistic about a certain form of identity politics, but not the essentialist form that is so often discussed when we discuss identity
I'm looking
politics.
at the essay right now, and she seems self-contradictory in the essay, talking about when Black folks critique essentialism, we struggle for radical Black subjectivity. Like, you can have multiple identities and still have Blackness as a category be essentially different from whiteness, which is her claim.
So where's the contradiction?
Her contradiction is, she says, I mean, part of it is she's critiquing essentialism. She's saying we don't want to be essentialists in our claims, right?
Right. Where essentialism is like all Black people think the same or have the same experience.
No, that does not necessarily need to be essentialism. To say that like all women are essentially different than all men does not imply that all women are interchangeable and identical. It claims that there is some essential quality about women that makes them different from men.
So I could see that as a conception of essentialism, but if you read through the essay, the kind of essentialism that she's critiquing is the kind of essentialism according to which there is like a unified Black experience, and that like based on this we can infer things about someone knowing only that they're Black, right?
So then why does she want a radical Black subjectivity?
I mean, the way that she phrases things, I agree, like could make it seem contradictory.
It's contradictory.
I mean, where does she say where does she say like we need a radical Black subjectivity?
She discusses.
I mean, she talks about
the essay as being. She talks about struggling against white supremacy, forming radical black subjectivity. She uses the we when discussing this. She says, our struggle for radical black subjectivity is the quest to find ways. So clearly she's arguing from a position where she's saying she wants to develop radical black subjectivity. That seems to be positing
Radical
an
black
identity
subjectivity,
category
it-
that is essentially different and opposed to whiteness.
Yes, of course. Like that's the trivial version of essentialism that I don't think she has any problem with. If she says that like whiteness and blackness are not identical.
So she's essentialist
Like,
when it's convenient
so-
to her. Like, come on, man.
No, no. This is an equivocation over the word essentialist. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Like there are two different kinds of essentialism.
This is a semantic disagreement between you and me.
Okay, I mean, okay, but all I'm saying is like if they have these two quotes that make it seem like she's like more in favor of essentialism, defined here particularly as seeing black people as having exactly one unified experiences, or
Where do they say that?
one unified black experience. Well, no, I mean,
I didn't read it that way. I didn't read the book's interpretation of what she was saying as that sort of an essentialism. I read it more as she was saying, I mean, I guess I'm no expert in this, so just tell me to shut up if I'm completely off here. But I read it as sort of given the current state and how things got to where they are, there are things about being black that are different than being white, and there's no real way to cross that as it is right now. And to me, that is somewhat
rejects
essential.
that, right? Nobody rejects that.
I reject that.
Oh, okay. I mean, would you reject it in 1984?
I'm not saying that there aren't problems. I'm rejecting the idea that me and my black neighbor across the street could not have almost identical lives. If it's, I'm not rejecting the possibility of that right now. I'm not saying that like
she's not rejecting that either. Like it. So, the quote that I'm focusing on in their description of bell hooks, she said, where they say on the top of page 56. That Hooks claimed that postmodern thought erred in destabilizing the concept of identity, which led it to exclude the unified voices and experiences of black Americans. To me, that suggests that they're attributing, that reads to me as if they're attributing to bell hooks the view that there is a unified black experience, right? In the essentialist sense, that like all black people have this set of experiences that we can assume that they have, or we know that they have, simply on the basis of their being black.
I guess I read it sort of as there. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but like there is an intersection of things that all black people experience that white people can't experience, and that to me is pretty essentialist. And that the implication there is that there are things
if
that
they're
white
saying
people,
that's.
Well, that's how if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but that's how I'm hearing what she's saying too. That there are experiences in both directions, that there are experiences that define blackness that white people can't experience, and that there are things that white people experience that are maybe unavailable to black people. So like the easy example is driving and not worrying about getting pulled over, but I have problems with that sort of perspective.
I mean, we can imagine a counterfactual where white people are the oppressed minority, where in literary devices, blackness is associated with purity and whiteness is associated with taint. So we can imagine a counterfactual where we can think of like white people having the same lived experience that black people have in the present day. And we could say that Hooks is arguing from the standpoint, arguing from the position that it is this lived experience which affects this black identity. But I don't take it when they say that Hooks is critiquing the concept of identity in postmodernism, which leads to exclude unified voices and experiences of black Americans. They're talking about I don't think they're making a mistake in referring to that Hooks does believe that there is a black experience in the U.S. and that that's what unifies these multiple black identities. She's critiquing society for saying that there's one black identity and saying that indeed there are many, but she's also arguing in her essay that there is some sort of experience that qualifies someone as black because they live in society that codes them as black.
Yeah, yeah. You know what? My problem with this would be the example of when somebody says you're acting white. Like, that's sort of the concern I would have with that. Like, if
Oh God, who said that to you?
no, I mean I act white all the time, but I'm allowed. No, but like if a black
You're
person
acting really white right now.
I always act really white. But
Could you melanate yourself, please?
no, but you know what I mean, right? Like how does a perspective
I know your caucasity disgusts me.
but could a black person completely agree with me that she's full of shit, or would they not be black? Would they lack blackness? And
Well, just ask Joe
course
Biden.
they
He's the
could.
one who says, if you don't vote for me,
No.
you ain't black. He's the arbiter of blackness, the leader of the black delegation.
but Sam, do you understand what my point is?
I don't see her as claiming that it is the point here supposed to be that if a black person read Bell Hooks' essay and thought this is bullshit, then according to Bell Hooks, that person wouldn't be black?
Maybe whatever she is qualified as blackness. I mean, can black people fit outside of that blackness identity?
I don't know how to answer the question without having read a lot more Bell Hooks.
I'm just
In the
So-
essay, Hooks is vague enough that she doesn't define exactly what qualifies someone as black, but you can kind of gather from her essay that it has something to do with the lived experience of black people in this society.
Well, my point is simply that whatever it is that if she was explicit, whatever it is, you're saying that black people have to fit in that. Like blackness is this. I mean, if you're going to create a category, there has to be what fits in it and what doesn't. Otherwise, it's not a category. An identity has to be a category, right? I mean, there's no such thing as an identity.
We're getting into serious nominalism versus Platonism questions right now, which are related to the discussion, but which again, so I raised my point. I raised my problem with the reading, and I get that people could have other readings of it. This was my problem with how they portrayed Bell Hooks in this essay.
Fair. You have not convinced me.
I can see defenses of it. That's fine. My dream is not to convince you.
No, I'm messing with you.
Does anyone else want to talk about it? Because I feel like it's so far just been the Three Musketeers.
Let's see. Also, I haven't checked the chat. If anybody's having trouble connecting to voice, let me know, because there were some issues. I think it should be fixed now. It doesn't look like anybody's going to speak up, though. But that's fair. Yeah, we don't agree on that. You've convinced me on a couple things, especially last time, but I'm not convinced by this, and I don't think you're going to convince Eric of anything, because that's not a criticism. I think Eric is very firm and has done a lot of research and knows a lot of what he's talking about, and he's not going to be easy to convince, which is a good thing.
I mean, I've been explicit with Sam, and I hope last meeting that there are some of his criticisms that I consider quite good. I think there are many ways in which their definition of postmodernism is loosey-goosey, doesn't necessarily apply to all postmodernists, and doesn't apply to all the areas of critical theory. I think they could have done a better job establishing their genealogy and connecting postmodernism to the places where it actually does connect to critical theory, because when they're talking about these the black feminists like Hook and Crenshaw, I think Crenshaw may cite Foucault, but I'm not sure that Hooks explicitly does. She cites postmodernism in that quote that they give it, but when we get to the postcolonial chapter, they explicitly cite Foucault and other postmodernists. So we see some of the direct genealogy there. But yeah, I also agree in plenty of the areas where Sam says many more citations are needed. I continually write in the margins things like "says who," because
Yeah.
they could do a lot better. Like they could do a lot better in certain areas, citing exactly like other people who interpret Foucault this way. That would be a totally fair thing for them to put in the first chapter, because they express a number of interpretations of Foucault, and you have to wonder, do other scholars actually interpret Foucault this way? But as they make a bunch of claims about the aims of theory as opposed to postmodernism on page 47 and 48. And I created all these marks in my book suggesting I thought they needed citations. But then later in the chapter, they actually do a pretty good job establishing that bell hooks says many of the things that they claimed on 47 and 48. So in some of the areas where they seem to need citations, they seem to provide the evidence within a few pages. So in ways, I'm satisfied with the book. But yeah, it doesn't feel like without some areas where it's lacking, some areas where it could be better substantiated, some areas where it really could be clearer. But I think even Jimmy, you brought up the good critique last time, which is that how are we to define postmodernism? Doing that
You
is a
can't.
fool's errand.
Yeah.
So when we argued over that last time, yeah, we're wasting time. And in a way, like I'm surprised Pluckrose and Lindsay were willing to waste their time putting a definition out there, trying to tie together postmodernism to critical theories.
Yeah, actually, I think it was after you left. One of the things we talked about is the introduction, and especially the first chapter, and I think the second chapter sort of feel, now that I've read the third chapter, feel tacked on. It feels like somebody read the book and was like, you need to talk about what postmodernism is because nobody knows what the fuck that is. So you have to put a couple chapters in there to describe it and connect it, and it feels totally disconnected. And to your point, I agree with the lack of citation. Like the one note I took on this part with hooks was I quoted "to be of value," and like I quoted that because it was like, well, that seems inherently unpostmodern to me, and I couldn't figure out where that came from. They say "to be of value," Hooks argued postmodern, blah blah blah, but they attributed a thought to Hooks, but I couldn't figure out where. And that is kind of frustrating in this book, especially when they talk about postmodernism. So I think we all three of us agree that their critique of postmodern philosophers is very much lacking. The other thing that's frustrating, and this is probably because I'm much more of a layman than the two of you, but I read this and it strikes me as true in a way because it feels like what people actually believe in my interactions with them. Especially, like I live near several colleges, and I used to go and talk to kids all the time, and it feels very accurate to what a lot of people would say. So maybe attributing it to they're trying to attribute it to somebody, and maybe they can't. But something about it rings very true to me.
I think they do a fair job citing a number of their positions. I think they could do a better job also. Yeah, there are a number of places where, we kind of get to like some of the actual positions that people hold in the modern day in the next chapter where they talk about decolonizing the university. And I was waiting for them to substantiate their claim that the university gets decolonized, or get their efforts to decolonize universities, and they ended up providing those some evidence for that in page 77 and 78. But yeah, my experience with it was getting a literature degree and having a professor that I took multiple classes for being heavily influenced by post-colonial theory. And I kind of he's someone that I think of as I read through this because I'd really like to know his thoughts. He's someone I really respect.
I'm going to suggest we move to the next chapter. You guys can tell me no, there's quite a bit left in this chapter, but I think it's going to be a lot more of this kind of conversation. But it's really up to you guys. I'm fine with sticking it through. I do have notes throughout. I have enough to talk about, but I don't think it's going to... Sam, what do you think? Do you think that there's much more to talk about with this chapter?
No, the only other point I had about the chapter, and I think it'll probably be best if I just sort of say it and we move along. I mean, that might seem unfair to people. People can push back on it if they think it's worthwhile. It's just that they say on page 57 when they talk about Kimberly Crenshaw, and her discussion of how certain social identities like race and gender, while socially constructed, in her view, still have meaning and have consequences. And then as they analyze it, they say that is, they are objectively real. And to me, I was like, wait a minute. Saying that something is objectively real is sort of the opposite of saying that it's socially constructed. In at least in terms of like analytic metaphysics jargon in philosophy, right? To say that something is real is to say that it's completely like mind independent, and to say that it would exist even if like no humans existed and that sort of thing, right? Like if all human beings went out of existence today, then the Eiffel Tower would still be there, right? That's an example of something objectively real.
Where is the contradiction
versus
on page 57? Can you?
So on page 57, so it's towards
Okay,
it's
I
at the
see
very
it
bottom.
Very bottom.
Yeah. So Crenshaw argues that identity categories, quote, have meaning and consequences, end quote, semicolon, that is, they are objectively real, right? And so there's like two ways you could read this. One way is that like Crenshaw is sort of contradicting herself if you take objective reality to be the opposite of
It seems like you
socially
do need
constructed
the
reality.
rest of, like the following sentence. She distinguishes between a black person and a person who happens to be black. Where I haven't read the work from Crenshaw, and I could bring it up if necessary, but it seems like a person who happens to be black suggests that like someone who is coded by society as black and has the lived experiences of someone who is socially coded as black throughout their life. Whereas a black person, as opposed to a person who happens to be black, is someone who has some, I don't know, essence of blackness within them, a black soul, like sort of a melanated soul, as one might say.
Right.
And that seems to suggest that Crenshaw believes that there is some like essential difference that distinguishes blacks from whites. That is possibly more than
I'd
a
have
social
to read
construct.
I'd have to read the Crenshaw to be able to comment on that, and I do plan on reading it eventually because I want to make sense of the book as a whole. And this essay that they're citing here is pretty crucial in the critical race theory and intersectionality chapter.
There's someone in the YouTube who's making some comments that I think we ought to address too.
Oh, sorry, I have not been paying attention to the YouTube comments.
Yeah, I haven't looked at it.
So we have a British
what are they?
listener who says, I asked him to clarify his position, and he said, I'm looking a little back to see if
What's the username?
His username is David Noble. So David Noble says, my position is that they are making a mountain out of a molehill. They're trying to link this to postmodernism to give some legitimacy to their point of view. And I wonder whether you guys would agree that, I mean, because you look at the title, Cynical Theories, How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. I think that's the question. Is there this cynical approach coming out of academia that's an activist scholarship that's influencing society to think about race, gender, identity more, and that harms people? David Noble seems to be skeptical of that claim.
I
think the crucial question that David is raising is like, how are we to assess the gravity and the volume of what they're pointing out? How are we going to determine just how pervasive this problem is? Just how much of academia has been sort of corrupted by this influence, and like, how do we assess that? And I think that's a serious question, and one that couldn't be answered easily. Like, we just don't have the sort of data that you would want to actually answer it in an empirically or a scientifically respectable way.
I think there's some out there. I mean, I think things like polls about the political affiliations of university professors, whether university professors feel safe saying things like gender is real, sex is not a social construct, whether there are threats to the funding of certain studies, like studies examining differences in performance between the genders, like whether there are threats to studies that look at whether there are other alternative causes for things other than structural racism. I think there are certain positions that are clearly sort of unacceptable in academic circles right now that are reflected by things like funding, scholars not willing to take those positions publicly, papers being retracted or canceled. Uh, and polls of people
You're
about whether
clearly
or not they feel safe expressing certain ideas in the academy. And we kind of know where that lands. So I'm surprised that
well,
David would be skeptical
I mean,
of that.
I mean, just so you like to be straight up about it. I am not aware of these numbers. I haven't seen these numbers. I mean, I haven't actively sought them out either. But these seem like the sort of figures that Pluckrose and Lindsay would need to cite in order to substantiate the severity of the claims that they're making about how this poses, a serious threat, that threatens to undermine the very fabric of advanced civil societies.
It's very
so I mean,
hard.
Eric, I'm glad like that you're aware of this stuff, but maybe they're aware of it too, but they should cite it and they should use it to make their argument stronger. Otherwise, I mean, just by citing that there are these theorists who think these things, it doesn't convince me that that the humanities or social sciences are overrun by these problems.
Yeah, I mean, I think for some of the things I'm referencing are you can find a discussion around the campus free speech crisis between Heterodox Academy and the Niskanen Center, with the Heterodox Academy taking the affirmative that there is a free speech crisis on campus, and the Niskanen Center taking the, what do you call it in debates, the negative side, whatever. But
It's also
and so that's useful.
It's very hard to know what people don't feel comfortable saying. I mean, that's a really hard thing to find out about.
You ask them. There are a number of polls where you ask people, do you support the concept of free speech? And then you ask them, do you support the concept of free speech for exploring differences between the races, differences between the genders? Do you explore free speech for communists? Do you explore free speech for people who are ethno-nationalists? And there are varying degrees of which people are willing to accept the free speech rights of certain causes or certain beliefs, while in general, free speech is given like sort of a high rating. So you ask people what they think is acceptable, and you ask people whether they would feel comfortable expressing their ideas in the classroom, and then you ask them their political ideology, and then you look to see if there are any relationships there. And in general, conservatives express significantly higher rates of feeling uncomfortable expressing ideas in the classroom than do liberals.
I have no doubt of that, just from my own lived experience. But just like I said, I live
Postmodernist.
near. I was on purpose. Like I said, I live near several colleges. One pretty big one is like I run through there every day, and I used to drive Uber here, and I've talked to a lot of kids, and I'll tell you, I don't go to school there, and I know when I'm supposed to be uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable having opinions, so I cannot imagine what some 20-year-old kid feels if they have even the slightest disagreement about some of these topics. So that's like I don't know the data on it. I only know that I definitely know that when I walk on campus, there are things that are way harder to say, and it should be the exact opposite. When you walk onto a campus, you should feel like you can say pretty much anything, because if it's stupid, then they'll just be like, you're being stupid. But it doesn't feel that way. I don't feel comfortable having actual discussions with college people and people on the university campus.
Yeah, they mentioned this phenomenon, but they don't necessarily substantiate it on page 63. They say the claim that Teachers or scholars were previously expected to set aside their own biases and beliefs in order to approach their subject as objectively as possible. Teachers could consider their attempts at objectivity successful if their students didn't know what their political or ideological positions were. I think one of the effects that we end up seeing when it's unacceptable to express certain ideological positions on campus is simply that conservatives aren't going to go to college. They're not going to seek it out. I don't identify as a conservative in almost in very many ways at all. I'm pretty I'm left of center, but have moved closer to the center. But I think in the coming generation, we'll really see a lot more that conservatives choose to go to routes other than college, whereas the academy increasingly becomes a place for liberal ideology unless we see a radical shift, because right now liberal professors outnumber conservative professors at a rate of 9 to 10 to 1.
Mm-hmm. The note I took on that page is, this is Pluckrose and Lindsay's lived experience. And my point with that note was to remind myself that this sort of illustrates to me why there actually is some value in postmodernism, and because in order to really combat this, you're going to have to talk about that as a conservative, I feel something that you clearly don't feel on campus. I'm not a conservative. I mean, I'm probably a lot more conservative than a lot of people in some ways, but I think I'm very liberal in other ways.
I don't know that you need a claim, like you don't necessarily need a postmodern critique. You need an appeal to renewed liberal values, where liberal values do sort of prioritize that upholding certain principles like free speech are going to be deeply uncomfortable ones. Free speech, Noam Chomsky, I think, as far left of center as you can get. Noam Chomsky has been known for saying that free speech means defending the right to speak of people you despise and viewpoints you despise.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I guess my point being, I think there are spaces that I've been where I don't think anybody there has any malice in their heart and has any intent of silencing me, and yet I feel very much like if I were to say the wrong thing, the wrong person might be within earshot, and my life could be a lot more ruined than it needs to be. And that's an experiential thing. So I don't know. I think there's something to be said about. I do think I do think, to go back to the discussion about whether feelings are objective or not, I don't think I can make that claim, but I think they matter.
So there's a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin named Daniel Bonavac, and he has I've watched a number of his lectures on the analytic tradition, but he makes a point in an interview where he said a student approached him and they said, "Professor Bonavac, are you a conservative?" And he said, I'm so disappointed that that came across in my lectures. How did you find out?" And he said, "Well, it didn't come across in your lectures, and that's how I knew you were a conservative." He said, "You didn't let me know your ideological standpoint, so I knew you must be conservative." Which, this guy was using as a self-serving shill for it's so good to be a conservative. We're the last neutral ones. I think there's some interesting evidence to suggest that conservatives may be more neutral than we give them credit for. But it's an interesting take. Bonavac, smart guy, very MAGA. I don't get MAGA, but he's very MAGA.
My own experiences go along with that. The people I grew up with are very conservative. The people I hang out with now are mostly very, very progressive. And the conservative people I have never felt uncomfortable with. I've felt, that intense aggression, that aggressive feeling towards what I'm saying because they don't like it. But I've never felt like there was any danger in me disagreeing with them, and I don't feel that way with a lot of my progressive friends. A lot of my progressive friends, it feels dangerous to have an opinion.
Interesting thing, even though progressives and people on the left and people who identify as liberal are more likely to say that we're the ones actually talking about race issues, conservatives are more likely to report that they have black friends. In fact, significantly more likely.
I kind of feel like a lot of this is speculation, though, because I can say the same thing about a lot of.
Oh, Your audio cut out.
That last point was from the American National Electorate Survey, coming from the statistician Zach Goldberg. So I'm happy to send you the link to substantiate that one.
Choopy, it says you're making. I can't hear you. I don't know if it's not coming through or it says you're making noise, but I can't hear you. Can anybody else?
She's coming back. She just dropped.
Oh, she's back. Still can't hear you though.
Still can't hear you though.
Sorry.
There you go. Sorry, what were you saying?
Now we can hear you.
Okay, where did I cut off at?
You were saying
right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning.
Yeah.
So what I was saying was that I think that's kind of speculation because I can say the same thing about a lot of my liberal friends is that that they take various positions on topics and I can feel like I can have conversations with them. So I think that's a lot of has to do with your environment and who you're around because you know I can say the same thing for both sides.
Well,
I've met a lot of liberals who I can have conversations with and not feel like they're pushing me to a position, and I can have constructive conversations with them. And then, the same thing on the right.
I'm actually I agree with you. I'm distinguishing liberal from progressive. So by progressive, I get what you're saying though, because I do have more progressive friends who I can have serious conversations with, but those people tend to be, Biden supporters. Like they're
Jimmy, you're just really comfortable with your conservative friends because they're ethno-nationalists and you're a white guy.
No, but Choopy, I do hear your point. There are people. My father has never revealed to me his political beliefs, and I can't figure it out, and it frustrates me. But it's a good thing that I don't know. It's a good thing that I don't know. But I would assume he's more what?
I was making Eric's joke.
Yeah,
for
it
him.
must be a conservative.
No, I would actually assume he's much more your standard liberal American, boomer liberal American.
Yeah.
Boomers are liberal?
My
What?
My grandmother and my aunt, neither one of them have ever spoken to me about their political beliefs, but I do think that they're both liberals, and I've had many conversations with them that were very centric, and I learned a lot. And sometimes they take very conservative positions on those topics, even though I think a lot of the things that they do kind of reveal that they're a little more progressive.
I'll give a little example though.
Just like the past 15 minutes have been completely unrelated to the book.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Like,
you're right. Well, I'm doing.
Should we get back?
I'm doing a terrible job. I apologize. It's my fault.
Some of it had to do with. I mean, a lot of that had to do with page 63, where they make the change, where they talk about the eroding barrier between scholarship and activism, and whether or not professors are expected to be ideologically neutral, or not expected to be, but expected to come across in their teaching as ideologically neutral. So yeah, one of the questions there is, do Pluckrose and Lindsay substantiate that this is a shift that's taking place in the university? And no, they don't substantiate it, but it's interesting to look into whether or not there are areas that do. I think for them to substantiate it would take another book. And I think there are other books that are out there substantiating it, like The Coddling of the American Mind. I think is probably the best example of the book that substantiates that last point. But there are going to be lots of things they can't substantiate. I'm looking forward to Jonathan Church's book tackling white privilege and white fragility. But we can't get it all in one place.
Yeah, there's a lot of this book that I agree is not substantiated, but feels very true based on my own life. But
I think that some of it is. Like some of their main areas around their main thesis, like does critical theory have a genealogy? Is critical theory related? Does critical theory have this just sort of threaten some values that we ought to hold, like values like wanting to aspire towards objectivity, values like valuing certain reasons and certain methods of getting at true models or better models than others. They threaten the idea that we ought to value certain ways of knowing that are more reliable ways at getting at knowledge than others. And perhaps they're not as articulate as I'd always like them to be, but I think they do a good job on their core of substantiating that, yes, a number of these theories are related, and they do threaten some good beliefs that we ought to hold in a way that is important to know and consider, because they might be a threat to our society, sort of the why this harms everybody part.
I have but maybe it would be a good idea right before, because we're going to start chapter 3, but to what do the people who want to speak feel like they have established well enough so far? So for me, what they've established well enough so far is that they've established that postmodernism, to me, I agree, postmodernism poked a hole and it had to be filled, and it doesn't actually solve any problems. It only highlights problems. So it something had to come in its wake. I agree with that. And the other thing I agree with it, and I think they've established, is that critical theory, which is at the core of these disciplines, for lack of a better word, that they're going to critique, is at the core of all of it. But I don't think anybody disagrees with that, and that they use postmodernism at least as so far as to critique the oppressor class as they see it. They don't use postmodernism to talk about what's good about the oppressed class, but they absolutely use postmodernism to describe why the oppressor class is wrong and why it shouldn't be considered in any way. Other than that, I don't feel like they've said that much. I'm curious what you guys think has been adequately said so far. Sam, do you think anything?
They're gonna try to show They're gonna try to show something in the book.
That's it. It's funny. I think, Eric, you just described what you feel like they have done so far.
Yeah. Was there anything that I needed to clear up?
No. That's what made me. I was curious what everybody else thought, because I could tell we're on different pages. You and I are on different pages in thinking about, and we're not going to get into the discussion of the meaning-shaped hole in people's hearts. Sam and I and you are. Sam is in disagreement with both of us because he doesn't think he's established anything, or they haven't established anything. So just moving forward, it might just be good to keep that in mind, that some of us feel like some foundation has been formed and Sam does not.
I feel like so far in the book, they've completely revealed that they're coming from a very biased point of perspective. And a lot of the assertions that they make, I feel like are opinions as opposed to
You and Sam are pretty close on the same page on that, I think.
yeah.
I think there's a lot of opinions. I agree with you.
It doesn't feel like a very honest, how in the introduction it basically said, oh, we researched all of this, but, it doesn't feel like they really took the perspective that it's like they went into it with the expectation that they were going to just come and write this book. It wasn't
And this is the cynical approach that they purport to be describing that is wrong with all the scholarship, right?
Exactly.
Is that these people already know their conclusions, and that it's a bunch of they see the world as cynically as possible. And to me, this book is a product of Pluckrose and Lindsay seeing all this scholarship in the most cynical way possible.
Yep, I agree with that.
What about the specific?
I came in an hour late, and you guys haven't started chapter 3.
Yeah, we're gonna get to chapter 3. All right, we'll move on.
I mean, does anyone else wanna chip in there? Right, we have a few other people who haven't given. If you wanna, answer Jimmy's question. I think I'll take that as a no. Nobody's unmuted themselves.
Yeah.
All right. So, Chapter 3, Post-colonial theory. So, they sort of start off with a big summary. They talk a little bit. They do a little bit of genealogizing, with discussion of sort of, they call like the founder Edward Said, who was explicitly, self-admittedly influenced by Michel Foucault, but really post-colonial theory's main influences go back further to writers like Frantz Fanon, who was very influential in areas like phenomenology and post-colonial theory, and sort of the broad outgrowth of those thinkers who were broadly inspired by Marx but not satisfied with the Marxist project, like Jean-Paul Sartre also. Who else? Then they discuss. Yeah, so they discuss. They give like a preview of what they're going to say, and then later on they go on to say it. So I'm going to skip all the stage setting. I don't have much to say about what they said about Edward Said. I mean, I haven't read Said and I don't intend to, but they actually give us evidence of him saying like, look, I'm inspired by Foucault. I'm going to use Foucault's concept of power knowledge to do this, which is welcome, right? I'm glad to see the explicit quotations. I think it's clear that the thinkers that they start talking about from chapters 3 to 7, they've actually read more closely than the thinkers they discuss in chapter 1. They give page numbers and such. Then after Said, we have Spivak, Gayatri, Chakravorty Spivak, and Homi Bhabha. Spivak is more influenced by Derrida than by Foucault, and she talks about the subaltern. These are colonized peoples who have been subordinated by colonialism, and she did coin the term epistemic violence that later went on to be discussed by Christy Dotson, as we'll see in chapter 8. So the first point of critique I have comes from their discussion of Spivak on the bottom of page 72. The paragraph at the bottom of 72 says, Spivak's postmodernism is especially evident when she adopts from Derrida the deconstructive idea that there is subversive power in maintaining stereotypes within power-laden binaries while inverting their hierarchy. So the idea seems to be from that description. I mean, I haven't read Derrida. The idea seems to be from that description that we take like a stereotype like, men are strong and women are weak, and we embrace it for like feminist purposes by saying that actually it's better to be weak than to be strong. That seems to be the basic idea. As they say, there is subversive power in maintaining stereotypes within power-laden binaries while inverting their hierarchy. They say that Spivak calls this idea strategic essentialism. So I went and found the chapter that they're discussing, that they cite, and I couldn't find this kind of analysis. I saw Spivak talking about essentialism, and when she talks about strategic essentialism, it doesn't seem to be a matter of inverting hierarchies. It seems to be a matter of embracing the essentialist idea that there is like a unified colonial experience, right? Or that there's a unified black experience or a unified experience of being a woman for the purposes of resisting patriarchy, or in the other cases, resisting racism or resisting colonialism. And the example she gives is the Marxist idea of class consciousness, where the proletariat sort of embraces a sort of essentialist way of thinking about society, that there is a unified proletarian experience that is in contrast to the bourgeoisie experience. And why do they embrace this essentialism? Well, because for strategic purposes, right? For political organizing, for the purposes of gaining like union rights or something like that. I don't see how this has anything to do with inverting a hierarchy and embracing stereotypes. I could see how one could see the embracing of stereotypes as relevant to this, but inverting the hierarchies, I didn't see any evidence for this in the Spivak chapter. Yeah, so they say their discussion on 73 goes, strategic essentialism at the top of 73. Strategic essentialism applies the same sense of monolithic group identity as an act of resistance, suspending individuality and in-group diversity within the subordinated group for the purpose of promoting common goals through a common identity. In other words, it defines a particular kind of identity politics built around intentional double standards. I don't see what these double standards would be, and I get the part about regarding it as a monolithic other, right? Regarding the group to which one belongs as monolithic, that's like textbook essentialism. But I don't see what the double standard is, and I don't see how there's any reversal of hierarchy. And I don't see that anything that they say in this chapter in their discussion of Spivak explains how they got to that conclusion.
Eric's not
So,
there
I
to
mean,
disagree.
did anyone else have any thoughts about that?
I was trying to find the paper
Yeah.
because I didn't.
I think that just goes back to the speculation, how what kind of experiences you have in your environment. And that's kind of what has been a common trend throughout this book, is that they take facts and then just kind of speculate on their personal experiences and the opinion formed around that.
So are you suggesting that, one of the authors or both of the authors might have had experiences where people gave this sort of definition of what Spivak is talking about, or some activists cited Spivak and said, look, strategic essentialism, and then gave some sort of analysis of it, and it sounded like this, and so they went with it.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a plausible hypothesis. Because the paper they cite, I couldn't find evidence for it. So, I mean, where else would they have gotten the idea? I'm not sure. If it was another scholar giving their interpretation of Spivak, well, then they should probably cite that person instead of Spivak.
I found the paper. I just.
And they are right when they talk about Spivak, that she is very difficult to read, right? She's not a very clear writer, much like Derrida, right? There seems to be a bit of intentionally obfuscating language.
That's the most frustrating part.
But I don't.
To me, every time I try to read something like this, it's like it's like you tried to make it so I couldn't understand this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a valid critique. I have no issue with that critique, but the critique seemed to go further. So then the next thing I have is on page, at the bottom of page 74, spilling over to 75, they sort of wrap up their analysis of these pioneers of post-colonial theory, Spivak, Said, and Baba. And they say that theirs is not an investigation of the material realities affecting countries and people that were previously under colonial power and the aftermath of that, but an analysis of attitudes, beliefs, speech, and mindsets which are sacralized or problematized. These they construct simplistically from assumptions that posit white Westerners and knowledge that is understood as white and Western as superior to Eastern, black, and brown people and knowledges associated with non-Western cultures, despite that being precisely the stereotype they claim to want to fight. So, I'm not sure what sort of a citation would even justify this kind of claim. Like, not only do they not give textual evidence for this kind of claim that these thinkers are constructing these sorts of mindsets simplistically from assumptions that posit white Westerners as superior to Eastern, black, and brown people and the corresponding knowledges, despite that being the stereotype they claim to want to fight. What? It seems to me anything, assumptions would be that while Westerners see themselves as superior to Eastern, black, and brown people and those kinds of knowledges, that in fact these kinds of knowledge systems and these sort of ethnic groups or races are not superior. I could see how one could claim that, but here Pluckrose and Lindsay are attributing to the pioneers of post-colonial theory the idea that they start from the assumption that white Westerners are superior to Eastern, black, and brown people.
I was listening
and that,
from across the room, but can you tell me what page you're on right now?
74.
Yeah. Bottom 74 to 75. The last sentence of 74 that spills over to 75.
Yeah. I mostly wanted to jump in here because I felt like I understood exactly what they meant. I mean, when post-colonial theorists are discussing the other ways of knowing, I mean, they talk about it sort of at the end of the chapter where other critics of post-colonial theorists who yet still take a sort of post-colonial approach say that they are sort of reifying the Orient or Eastern thinking, or, you know, like if you think, oh, Indian people are really superstitious, they're very like Hinduism, a very superstitious religion, like, and then what do you want to say? Do you want to say, no, all these superstitions are not superstitions, they're merely other ways of knowing. They're just as valid as something like reason or science. Or do you want to say, well, no, these are people that can come around to like ways of knowing that are more reliable at getting at models that help you predict what's going to happen in the world. They can merely be introduced to science. But like, which one do you want to do? Do you want to argue for the value of superstition, which would reify that that sort of people from the Orient and the East are not able to do the things that people from the West can do? Or do you want to say that these are people who share a human universal and can come to the value of reason? So I totally think that there's a case where those thinkers seem to emphasize that, yeah, these other ways of knowing, these Oriental ways, are being rejected by the West, but they are just as valid. And it's like, okay, well,
But here we haven't gotten yet to the definition of research justice, where where research justice is explicitly characterized as making room for or accommodating these sorts of other ways of knowing, like superstition, etc. Right here, we're just talking about Said, Spivak, and Baba, and none of the quotes they've given have indicated that there's anything like intentional accommodation of superstition and you know indigenous or ancient knowledges as just as valuable or as just as respectable or reliable as something like science. I haven't seen any of that yet, and yet we're only talking about the pioneers here. Breathe in, Jimmy. You preparing for something? I just heard a big inhale.
I'm sort of feel stuck between both of your interpretations because I kind of understand both of them. And I'm not sure what I think. I was trying to think about that.
I mean, I just haven't seen any of that. Like I'm not a huge fan of, like, as stated, right? If they've correctly explained the positions of Saeed, Spivak, and Baba, I don't think that this stuff has a whole lot of value, right? But I haven't seen any reason to think that these thinkers think that, like, non-scientific spiritual claims have just as much authority, epistemic authority, as science. Like, I just haven't seen it yet. They do cite some people who say explicitly these sorts of things later on in the chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't have much to say. I think we can move on because I think we're
Okay.
the only way to really, we're trying to mind read what they meant by that, I
Right.
guess. And
Well, I mean, it seems clear enough to me that they're talking so far just about the pioneers of the theory, these three thinkers, and that you have the claim they construct these mindsets from assumptions that posit white Westerners and knowledge that is understood as white and Western as superior to Eastern black and brown people and knowledges associated with non-Western cultures, despite that being precisely the stereotype they claim to want to fight.
well, I
That
mean,
seems like,
where are the universities that they're doing the studying in? Where is the rigor coming from? It's not coming from, I mean, it's a truism that
but
it doesn't.
Yeah,
I-
but that's
like,
more of today's radical liberalism as opposed to being foundational from these theories. It's not. It's something that people today have taken and kind of twisted to fit their narrative, whereas back when these theories came about, they were very useful in the time. Postmodernism kind of laid the foundation for desegregation and changing people's minds around, race and that whole time period. So I think just because,
yeah,
just because something has been twisted today in today's society doesn't mean that it was based on these theories. I think that's just their opinion about it.
for them to attribute these assumptions to these thinkers when they haven't given us any evidence of these assumptions in the thinkers' actual works, I think that's, like, the problem that I'm seeing here.
I guess my point
Just
is, if you're
another
going to use
citation needed.
Western academia as the platform in which you are going to try to convince people of what you're saying, you've already decided it's superior, right? It has to be. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it that way.
No,
Then why would you do it that way?
no, it doesn't. No, I mean, it doesn't show that it's superior.
No.
I mean,
that you believe it's
the
superior.
context. No, but it does. No, but it doesn't even show that. Like, just because, like, I might believe that if I could do my philosophy at Oxford, that I would become a better philosopher, right?
Mhm.
But the fact that I choose not to even apply to Oxford or Cambridge doesn't mean that I believe that Oxford or Cambridge, right, are not as, like, not on the same par as the American universities that I applied to for a PhD program, right? I mean, I can see how one might make that argument, Jimmy, but I don't think the argument is going to work
I'm trying
as
to.
as a clear way of accessing another person's assumptions.
Yeah, it's fair. That's fair. I guess I think you can't. I can't see how you avoid the assumption. Either the method you're using is superior, in which case this method is valuable in explaining why it's not as valuable as what I'm trying to explain, or I'm using the method to explain why the method itself isn't as useful as other methods.
Here we would get into questions about whether like postmodernism is itself modern, right? Like, is deconstruction, even though it claims to be deconstructing like modernism itself, is it still like a modern practice or like a Western one, even though it's critical of the West? I think we should probably just move on though,
Yeah.
because it's not so much to do with the book itself.
That's totally fine.
So the four mindsets I was the next thing I wanted to talk about. So on page 76, they give a Western colonial mindset, a liberal mindset, a postmodernist mindset, and an applied postmodernist mindset. So the Western colonial one is like clearly abhorrent. It says Westerners are rational and scientific, while Asians are irrational and superstitious. Therefore, Europeans must rule Asia for Asia's own good. A liberal mindset says all humans have the capacity to be rational and scientific, but individuals will vary widely. Therefore, all humans must have all opportunities and freedoms. A postmodern mindset, they say, says the West has constructed the idea that rationality and science are good in order to perpetuate its own power and marginalize non-rational, non-scientific forms of knowledge production from elsewhere. And then the applied postmodern mindset that they attribute to postcolonial theory says the West has constructed the idea that rationality and science are good in order to perpetuate its own power and marginalize non-rational, non-scientific forms of knowledge production from elsewhere. Now that's just a postmodern one, but it adds on, therefore, we must now devalue white Western ways of knowing for belonging to white Westerners and promote Eastern ones in order to equalize the power imbalance. So very specific. They're giving us the applied postmodern addendum to postmodernism is because of these power imbalances, we should seek, right, I guess, perfect equity. We should try to make Eastern values and ways of knowing on a level playing field of equal to Western ways of knowing. Now, I'm not sure why this necessarily follows, or that why this would from applied postmodernism as they've described it, right? So it could be that an applied postmodernist says that, but a postcolonial applied postmodernist could say instead that the West has constructed the idea that Western rationality and science are good. So we should promote non-Western ways of thinking about rationality and non-Western ways of doing science, right? So there are people who have argued this sort of thing, but that I actually have some experience reading. Folks like Sandra Harding, who says that there are certain indigenous knowledge practices that count as science given a basic definition of science as like updating your beliefs based on the available evidence. And the more evidence you accumulate, the more reliable your beliefs become. The better you are at determining which beliefs are reliable and which beliefs are unreliable. And she argues that there are some indigenous ways of knowing, as it's commonly referred to, on which indigenous people are practicing science, but they're not practicing the more specific, like Western way of doing science with experiments and isolating variables, etc. But she wants to say these are still ways of doing science. And she does say explicitly that like the way that we in the West, right, do physics and chemistry and the hard sciences is really useful. But she wants to say that actually indigenous ways of knowing with respect to, for instance, ecological management, right, like practices of fire management, I think it's hard to argue that that there are some ways in which I mean, I guess this you would probably want to get into the difference between propositional knowledge that, and practical knowledge how. But I think without it's clear that these are both forms of knowledge, and that you can argue that there are Western approaches to data gathering and observation that some Eastern or some indigenous communities might not share, yet that they still approach the gathering of information and observation in epistemically fruitful ways.
I want to go back to the four mindsets, especially the applied postmodern mindset, because you proposed an alternative, but I don't see how that alternative is any different from what they described. It seems like the only I mean, it seems like you just left out devalue Western, right? Just promote Eastern.
I did leave out the like devalue part, right? Because I don't see any need for that part. But I also said,
how do you promote one thing without devaluing the other thing?
Well, I mean, if I promote like my band's show next week, am I devaluing another band's show that occurs at the same time across town? Like
it depends. I mean, if I'm going to switch to school and say, let's say your university has X amount of dollars to spend on classes, and then you say, well, we need to promote this, so we're going to have to take it away from that. Like if you have 6 classes on Western science, I mean, and you say, well, we need at least 2 for Eastern science. I don't know what that would be exactly.
So if it's a zero-sum game, then yeah, promoting one thing will devalue the other thing. But I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. But just with response to how does my alternative to the applied postmodern mindset differ from the one they give, is the West has constructed the idea that rationality and science are good. I replace rationality and science with Western rationality and Western science, right?
True. Okay.
Again, I'm not an applied postmodernist. I'm just trying to give like a stronger version. So what I think they would say is they replace rationality and science with Western rationality and Western science, and non-rational and non-scientific with non-Western, basically.
But what if non-Western science is not science in terms of what the West has
well, if it's not,
as science?
Then it's.
I mean, but like
if it's not. I mean, so if you say, what if non-Western science is not science? Is it you're contradicting yourself already?
No. By
science it's not science.
No. By the West's definition of science, which is where the universities are, if the definition of the Western definition of science cannot include the Eastern definition of science, and I don't know that this is true, I'm just using it as an example, why is it wrong for the West to say, like, why not just say, okay, maybe we need to create a category for whatever the hell this is. It's not science by our definition, but it's something.
That's one possibility, but I'm just trying to give an alternative here, right?
But that's why I make it a zero-sum game, because I mean, I think in my experience that's what happens.
Yeah, there are a number of things here that are zero-sum games, like what books are taught to freshmen, like what books are required reading in the core curriculum. And a lot of the decolonize claims are or a lot of the contests to decolonize are about what are the books taught in the core curriculum. Sorry, there's a finite number of books that freshmen can read. And I think it's very charitable to assume of these people in post-colonial studies that they also see epistemology as a game where there are clearly better and worse ways to get to something that we might call knowledge, and that there are just strengths in the Western version and strengths in the Eastern version, and really the best epistemology possible would be like to know them both and be able to take the strengths of each version. I don't. I think that's much too charitable to them. There's the I think there's the assumption that these other ways of knowing that we might think of as superstition are just as valid as things that we might think of as more reliable epistemologies like the scientific method. As poorly defined as the scientific method is, I don't think it's particularly well defined, and I think we're continuing to discover biases in our process. But I think we also know that it is a much more reliable method than other ways of knowing. So yeah, I don't think that people looking to decolonize the West and decolonize science are taking all the strengths of Western science and also taking the East. Like they believe that the East or the indigenous peoples have discovered things that we have merely rejected because we're refusing to acknowledge their truth. Yeah, I'm thinking particularly of one of my that previous friend I might have mentioned her in the last episode, but she once told me that there were cures to cancer and cures for AIDS and all sorts of diseases in indigenous medicine, and the West was just not willing to recognize that these cures existed because they were refusing to put them through whatever process that they had because they just weren't interested in indigenous ways of knowing.
Yeah, I don't go as.
think it
Oh,
has
sorry.
to be.
Go ahead, Chupi.
I don't think it has to be so radical like that. When I'm having a conversation with someone who disagrees with me, I like to hear their opinion and evaluate it to see if maybe they know something I don't, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I think any less of my own opinion or that I'm just going to take theirs and adopt it. I'm going to think and consider it and not just kind of put it away because it's not my own.
Let me give you a silly example from my life. I was a coach of a wrestling team, and one of my kids on the team had a staph infection, which is a very serious infection. It can become life-threatening. And there was a group of mothers that were wrestling moms who would come to the practices sometimes, and they were very invested in Kangen water. Kangen water is alkaline water, and they believed that it was the cure to almost any health ill that could ail you. One of them pulled a little bottle out of her purse, said, "This is extra strong Kangen water I made from my machine." And all these moms were like, "Oh yes, good idea, good idea." She said, it'll get rid of your staph right away. Let me spray it on you. So she sprayed the kid, and clearly this is another way of knowing. This group of soccer moms has their set of beliefs and practices. They believe that this is really a way of treating disease. They believe that by applying this medicine that the disease will be alleviated. But the thing is, I was like, fuck you. Like, I don't care what you believe. I don't think it's valid. I'm not interested. You can get bent because this is a child whose life is threatened by a serious infection and they need to go to the ER. Like, I mean, as much as it's like, I can respect you, I don't think that's what decolonized narratives are about. It's not about you need to respect these other narratives. It's about these other narratives, as reliable or unreliable as they may be by your standards, are just as valid. And you ought to give them sort of equal worth, even though it's like, yeah, it's not of equal worth if you believe in Kangen water. The way you got to that is not interesting to me.
The question is whether they give us real examples of people arguing in your analogy as the soccer moms are arguing, right? And so one of the examples that I want to focus on is the essay that they highlight, the 2018 essay Decolonizing Philosophy, which comes on page 80 towards the bottom. It's written by Nelson Maldonado Torres and a number of others. So Maldonado Torres et al. And they say that, so they introduce it with the paragraph, in addition to criticizing empirical scholarship, decolonial narratives frequently attack rationality, which post-colonial scholars see as a Western way of thinking. Okay, so then the quote they give, "It will be difficult to contest the idea that, generally speaking, philosophy as a field or a discipline in modern Western universities remains a bastion of Eurocentrism, whiteness in general, and white heteronormative male structural privilege and superiority in particular. Now, I think it's clear to me that nothing in that is an example of them criticizing rationality itself. The next quote they give comes on page 81, and they just sort of give an example where they bring in the idea of power knowledge from Foucault, though they don't cite Foucault. And here, this is supposed to be an example of what is it? They talk about space and time. Yeah, time and space as Western constructs. But in the passage cited, they say, when engaging in non-European philosophies, it is important to avoid reproducing problematic conceptions of time, space, and subjectivity that are embedded in the Eurocentric definition of European philosophy and its many avatars. Now, to be clear, they haven't given an argument that Western ways of thinking about time and space are problematic, right? I am not going to just accept it because they have asserted it. But they're not dismissing time and space as Western constructs. Clearly, they're saying, look, there are ways of thinking about time and space that we reject. They're not dismissing time and space as Western constructs. And then the last piece of this paper that they cite the last passage they cite in their discussion comes from bottom of 81 to spilling over to 82, where they say philosophy seems to have a special place among discourses in the liberal arts because it focuses on the roots of the university at large, reason. This includes providing criteria for identifying and demarcating the humanities, natural sciences, and social sciences, blah, 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 etc. And the last sentence that they cite, the modern Western research university and liberal arts, therefore, owe much of their basic conceptual infrastructure to philosophical formulations of rationality, universalism, subjectivity, the relationship between subject and object, truth and method, all of which become relevant targets of critical analysis in the decolonial term. So, this is supposed to be given as evidence of them attacking rationality. In the essay, they never attack rationality or reason itself. The only things they criticize are Western conceptions of rationality, right? So they think that Western rationality is not the only way to think about rationality, and they go on to explore indigenous rationality and Asian rationality, which, according in these conceptions, the sort of divide between emotion and reason that we see in a lot of Western thinking is not as clear and explicit, and there are different ways of seeing the relationship between these things. I see no evidence of attacking rationality. I see in this paper that they are champions of reason, at least they claim themselves to be champions of reason, but they're saying, look, we haven't considered all of the ways of thinking about reason and rationality, and there are traditions outside of the Western philosophical tradition that have resources for reconsidering the way that we think about this concept. So, I mean, it's just, I mean, we're about to get to a point where I finally agree with the authors, where they talk about research justice, where I think that clearly, as described in some of these papers, research justice is problematic. But the essay that they're citing here as evidence of post-colonial theorists attacking rationality, I just don't see it in any of the passages that they've given us and in the essay itself.
I mean, it seems like the first quote, the public sense of what history is remains influenced by positivist tendencies, where the role of the historian is simply to reveal facts about past that are worth revealing, is a process removed from power. Sure, there's like a critique there that's a valid postmodern critique, which is like sort of the victors write the history. Oh, okay, like I'm with you. But combined with these other quotes, it sounds like they're This sounds like what I've seen again and again, where they sort of attack the soft sciences and maybe like loose concepts in the hard sciences. Oh, concepts of space and time that are problematic, not the ones that are like well established. But I see this as something where it's like, yes, you can have an interpretation of this where it's like, well, they didn't clearly say that rationality bad. They didn't have those words really close together, rationality bad. They were merely talking about how we should be skeptical of problematic aspects of various things that may be considered as rationality. It's sort of like they skirt the topic just enough. But I feel like this clearly says that later in the chapter they describe what they think of as sort of like Lindsay describes what you can think of as a positivist history. What is a history that we have better evidence to believe? What is a history that we have worse evidence to believe? And how can we use better evidence to write our histories? That's certainly a positivist take on history that I think is worth having. And yet these authors seem to critique that. They seem to critique the idea. Earlier in the chapter, they say the pretense of neutrality ironically makes our endeavors less valid. I mean, it seems to be that the idea of a neutral reasoner is something that they just reject entirely. Not the claim that like people can be neutral reasoners, but the pretense is certainly suggesting that if we have an ideal of neutrality, that would make it less valid as well. I don't know. I actually do see in these passages what they claim is in these passages. So I disagree with you there.
So I'm specifically referring to their quotations of just the essay, Decolonizing Philosophy, which they discuss on page 80 over to page 82. And this comes in, I think, the book called Decolonizing the University.
Yeah.
So the quote you talk about with neutrality from Kehinde Andrews, I think, yeah, like I agree with the idea that we will never achieve neutrality, but I still think neutrality is worth striving for. So I disagree with Andrews in that sense.
So I go through the Andrews quote, but then there is, let's see. So I'm trying to find your Decolonizing Philosophy starts with footnote 36. Yeah. While engaging in non-European philosophies, it is important to avoid reproducing problematic conceptions of time, space, and subjectivity that are embedded in the Eurocentric definition of Eurocentric philosophy and its many avatars. That's so vague. That's one of those things where it's like, yes, they're being vague. I can't nail them down. Are they really critiquing something or not? I don't know. Are they really just critiquing that, like, maybe Eurocentric concepts of punctuality are kind of like not everyone agrees with them culturally? I don't know. Or are they saying that quantum like electrodynamics is not valid for everyone, that there are other ways of coming to that knowledge? Are they saying that the theory of general relativity is a problematic aspect of interpreting time, space, and subjectivity? It's like somehow I just stop caring when it's like your critique is about like what's problematic and what's not, and any of it could be problematic, and I don't know. I guess it's totally subjective and up to you to determine what's problematic. That seems problematic to me.
But then we shouldn't conclude. My whole point is never to defend these thinkers. I mean, sometimes I will defend them if I think that they're right and they haven't been given their due diligence. But here it's just like they don't say what Pluckrose and Lindsay are attributing to them in these passages.
You don't think it's a plausible interpretation if I'm a student and I'm reading the passage on page 81 and I am in a course on post-colonial theory, that I can walk away from this passage, not having any education in physics myself, and say, those fucking physicists over there are just reproducing European concepts of time, space, and subjectivity. Like, I don't have a physics background.
That's not what they claimed. They claimed that these post-colonial theorists, they say post-colonial theorists insist European philosophy must be entirely rejected, even to the point of deconstructing time and space as Western constructs. That is nowhere in the essay that I read.
So you don't think the engaging non-European philosophies, it's important? So hold on. Let me go to the relevant part. It's important to avoid reproducing problematic conceptions of time, space, and subjectivity that are embedded in the Eurocentric definition of European philosophy. Physics is part of European philosophy. It may not seem like it anymore, but it's a branch of
you
natural
ask,
philosophy. It's a branch of natural philosophy.
Well, yes, but nobody uses that definition of philosophy in an academic context anymore.
Oh, I didn't realize philosophy wasn't about
Like-
knowledge anymore. Like what?
No. Philosophers can ask epistemological questions about physics, but physics itself, in the natural philosophy sense that like Kant would have used it, is people don't talk about that anymore that
Right.
way. I mean,
All-
I
but
doubt that these
every
people are-
philosophers that are thinking about the nature of space and time in analytic philosophy now are referencing papers on quantum physics. Like,
Sure.
so how are these? What's with the view that these like this knowledge has to be separated? That when we're talking about philosophy, suddenly I don't know, and like sometime in the 1900s it changed, and we no longer referred to various sciences as philosophy.
It's just I'm just making a point about how people talk about philosophy nowadays. When someone says European philosophy,
And again,
now,
my
they're
argument is
not
that it's a completely
including-
plausible reading to walk away from this and going, European philosophy, the European way of making sense of the world, the European way of loving knowledge and getting to it would include sciences that describe nature. Because those are part of the Eurocentric view.
wait. And we could conclude from this excerpt
Yes.
that European philosophy should be rejected.
So if I don't have a big science background and I come into this and I read this passage and I say it's important to avoid reproducing problematic conceptions of time, space, and subjectivity that are embedded in Eurocentric definition of European philosophy, I'll go, yeah, it sounds like I might want to reject those things because they're really just Eurocentric. How would I know that they're not Eurocentric? They certainly were all made by European men. I mean, Bohr, he's European. Planck, he's European. Heisenberg, European.
I just can't.
There are very few
I can't understand
Oriental physicists
how
in the quantum revolution.
how you can consistently accuse me of being uncharitable reading Pluckrose and Lindsay, and then say that this is a fine, perfectly charitable reading of this passage.
Yeah. I think part of it is that, yeah, some of this comes from my own biases. I'll acknowledge that, where it's that I have so much, I have a number of, like, my experiences getting a lit degree and my experiences with people who describe themselves as postmodernists is like they interpret these things this way. So I go, okay, like it seems like I feel like I have to misread it to interpret it that way, but I see people interpreting it that way. So how am I supposed to walk away from this with a different interpretation when I have people saying that there are indigenous people? Jimmy's lighting up a joint.
I'm freezing.
He's trying to get into that stoner way of knowing.
I'm freezing.
He's like, there's this baked epistemology that you got to get like, a few joints deep to really get into this
Watch
way of knowing.
Friday, next Friday, and Friday after next, all back to back to back.
It's not.
And
It's
then
not pot.
you
It's-
access.
And then you'll know the black lived experience in America. Yeah.
Can I
So-
can I butt in here a little bit and totally?
Yeah.
I mean, I actually always feel like I'm halfway between you guys, because so on the topic of, and also factor in here, I'm way more of a layman than you guys. But so when I read this, and it sounds like it's saying, I don't like the word problematic. I mean, that word really triggers the fuck out of me. So like when somebody says that like Western philosophy is problematic, that irritates me. I'm fine with saying there are aspects of philosophy that are not covered with Western philosophy, and maybe there's a need to have some kind of classes that are non-Western, and I'm fine with that. I'm a pluralist at heart. I have a hard time when you get into science, because with philosophy, I'm okay. I'm okay with there being different philosophical perspectives on like epistemology, aletheology. I am totally fine with that. I do think, as a religious person, I do think there are ways of knowing that are not scientific. So I'm totally okay with that. But when you get into science, like again, as a religious person, I would never want a science class to teach what I believe, ever. I would never want that. And so I don't see, for me, it becomes a huge problem when it verges on calling Western science is Western. I mean that's the way it is. It's the way that things happened. I'm sorry that happened that way. I mean, I can't change it. If there was some sort of discipline that our view of science totally rejected, but came out and turned out to be super useful and people started believing in it, then cool. I mean, evolution basically did that. Like there was a lot of scientists who thought that evolution was bunk, and honestly, the American Academy became such an institution because science proved itself. I mean, I'm fine with opening the door to different ways of looking at the world in terms of trying to prove themselves. I'm not okay with saying that there's something wrong with the way that we've figured out that's worked for us. That to me crosses a line.
Well, can I say something really quick? I think, and I may be missing something here, but I think kind of implicit in the idea of reason and rationality is that there's no such thing as Western rationality. To say that there's Western rationality is a criticism of rationality, right? Because that's a claim of rationality, is that there's no flavors of rationality.
Yeah, in a way.
I don't think so necessarily. I think there are different ways of thinking about reason or rationality, right, as this like faculty of the human mind. And I think that according to Western ways of thinking about rationality, I don't even know what this Western ways of thinking about it. I'm just applying, I guess, the ones that I'm familiar with within the Western philosophical tradition. According to that way of thinking about rationality, then I think what you said is true. I'm not familiar enough with other ways of thinking about rationality to give a fruitful explanation of what that would look like. I assume it has something to do with where you draw the line between reason and emotion or something like that.
Well, it's like even in that, you're like defining it in terms of reason, right? It's like there's still reason and emotion, and then you include a little bit more emotion and it's something else. But I think the idea of reason and that there's some other kind of reason that if we add something to it, there's like more or something different. I think that's against the sort of like core principles of rationality and reason. And that
But I don't think that's the idea. I don't think it's you add something to it necessarily. I think it's a question about what gets included in the definition of reason or rationality, right? So like for instance, Hume didn't think that there was such a thing as practical reason. Kant did think there was such a thing, in addition to theoretical reason, as practical reason, right? So those are within Western ways of, or Western tradition of thinking about rationality. Those are two different ways of conceptualizing rationality. Now you might have...
I have a question I think that illustrates at least my point. Is it problematic for me to say killing apostates is unacceptable? It's wrong, and it's wrong to believe that. Like, is that problematic? Because if that's problematic, then everything about the legal system is problematic. That's where I get irritated. Like, it's not problematic that the country that you're in that produced the academy came to it the way that it came to it. That's not problematic. It might be wrong. I'm open to the idea that it's wrong. I'm almost positive it's not complete. Like I am positive that it's not complete just from my own belief structure. But it's too far to start saying there's a problem with teaching that killing people for believing things is wrong.
I do get your point.
Nobody said that.
The one you were talking about Western, like there's arguments within rationality about what reason and rationality are. Like I get that, but there's still some arbiter that we all refer back to, and I don't think that that could possibly include the things that these are referring to.
Well, what are they referring to? The people in this text that I was reading and that there are excerpts from citing, they don't get explicit about what this other rationality, like this Eastern rationality, would be. But I'm sure that there is somewhere that I could go to look for it. And I mean, I'm not sure what you mean when you say there is this arbiter that we all refer back to. It might just be that there is this implicit assumption in conversations about rationality within the Western philosophical tradition that at least all of our conceptions of rationality have this thing in common. But I mean,
I think if there's
the
anything,
fact that we all assume it doesn't show that it's correct.
yeah, I think, but if I think reason can expand. I don't know. This is kind of like in the weeds a little bit. I do think that these passages are carving out room to do something bad to rationality, whether you think they do that thing or not. I mean, I guess that maybe that's up for debate because I'm not super familiar with all these people. Like you said, if they could present some like other form of reason that we could all agree, we're like, okay, yeah, we can fit that in, then maybe I can understand it. But I just feel like all the things that I've heard get pointed to like as ancient knowledge I'm like, yeah, that's not reason. Like, I don't think we have room for that.
Yeah, can I give another let me give another anecdote of a postmodern therapist, a quote I got from a postmodern therapist, which was that science can't actually tell us anything about reality because it's always changing its mind. So they clearly value as like a way of coming to know is having like beliefs that do not change, sort of a view of the world that do not change. They actually really valued ancient knowledge. So they really loved the zodiac. They really loved things like the Kabbalah and Zoroastrianism. Like they were all about ancient knowledges. Because those were the ones that had stood the test of time for them. They hadn't changed their minds in thousands of years. So I have a hard time saying like, okay, like, yeah, the European ways of knowing are changing their mind and they're problematic, and these other ways don't change their mind and we ought to adopt them more. Like I've seen people literally latch onto these odd beliefs as a consequence of this. So I know it seems bizarre, but
is that a result of humanity though, and misinterpretation, or is that core rooted in these theologies?
So that there
Because
have been so many people who died in religious wars, is that a problem of humanity's interpretation of these religious texts, or is it a problem with the religious text?
the first one.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of people who have fought in religious battles without. Anyways, I think we're getting a little off topic here, but
yeah, I mean,
I think the whole idea is that, like, you know, like what Jordan Peterson says, assume whoever you're listening to knows something that you don't. I don't think it's necessarily supposed to be taken as just throw all of your prior knowledge out the window, as opposed to giving charity to listening and exploring someone else's perception.
Yeah, I think a principle of charity is important, but I think you can quickly discover things about how people come to their beliefs. I mean, I'm kind of disappointed that we've got a guy who's watching on YouTube. We've got Reed watching on YouTube, and he runs a channel on street epistemology, and he kind of shows that if you can corral people in certain ways, that they will come to very similar ways of knowing, but you have to have a real skill and a tactfulness in pushing people with the right questions, but that epistemology is really about, are we asking ourselves the right question? And Jimmy, I'm kind of surprised that you can both have the position of non-overlapping magisteria, sort of like the state, which I take you to be making a statement of when you say something like, I don't believe that my religious belief should ever be taught in a classroom, but also believe that you have firm ground to stand on.
In a science classroom.
Okay, yeah, but in a science classroom. Okay, so that's fine because science and religion, non-overlapping magisteria, so that still works. But then also say, I believe I can say with like a sort of moral certainty that killing apostates is wrong.
I don't think that I can say that and know absolutely that I'm right. I think that in the country that I live in, that belief and that way of looking at the world has been dead fucking useful. So and it's part of it. So I'm a pluralist. So for me, in pluralism, you have to allow every pluralistic belief structure to have its own boundaries. Some overlap, some don't, but they're allowed to set their own boundaries. So if I, as a Christian, say I have room to believe science, and then I have room to believe this thing, I can do that, but I can't demand that you do. Like I can't. We're allowed to compete with our ideas. That's how I see it. But we can't compete if we have to get rid of the boundaries. And that's one of my criticisms of science, is sometimes I think science goes too far in demanding that people accept certain ways of looking at everything. That's how my belief structure works. It's inherently pluralistic and really pragmatic. I don't know if I explained how I see it properly, if I answered your question.
No, I understand your position. I could be, we could go into it more, but I don't want to derail us even further.
No, but I
to leave pretty soon.
Yeah, we have to keep going.
It's my brother's birthday.
Happy birthday,
on
Sam's
9/11.
brother. How old was he when that happened?
And it was his first birthday celebration
Jesus.
when the planes were.
Well, even better.
hijacked.
My fiance observed the holiday by taking the traditional flight to New York today. So her plane was empty.
Was it really?
Actually, I think there were like 4 or 5 people on there, but tickets were cheap, good prices.
Dude,
the holiday discount
I didn't even
is
know
wonderful.
that was
America has won.
thing.
Well, I mean, aren't flights relatively
I'll take
cheap
it
right
up.
now anyway, just because of COVID?
Not by that much. Because they just like started making it like pretty much 1 flight a day rather than like 4 or 5. But okay, so I just want to add my last bits before I have to head out.
This is
And then I'm
perfect.
sure there will still continue to be a helpful discussion without me.
2.5 hours.
So the research justice stuff on page 82, 83, 84, I think they actually here clearly give an example of a definition of research justice that is epistemically dangerous and not well thought through and doesn't have good backbone, logical backbone or empirical backbone. I don't see why we this seems clearly like a problem.
Yeah, I was. If
Thank
you
you,
took issue
Pluckrose
with
and
this
Lindsay.
one, yeah, if you took issue with this one, I was just like, you are gonna get totally owned. I mean, this is
indefensible. It seems obvious to me that like respect for reason and empirical adequacy are good things, and I don't think that like necessarily they're like that science and like logic are like at least logic in the I don't know about that. At least I think that there are arguments to be made that there are like non-Western conceptions of these things that can help us get a more informed picture of the world or humanity, right? I haven't seen the arguments, but I think that at least there are arguments to be made. The research justice thing looks like a pretty bad idea, though. I just want to highlight the last problem I had with the chapter, which was the conclusion of the chapter under the heading "A Dangerous Patronizing Theory," that starts at the very bottom of 85 and goes to page 88. So from page 86 to 88, there is a string of 8 consecutive paragraphs with no citations, making pretty sweeping claims about how dangerous post-colonial theory is, and actually pointing to specific examples or at least somewhat specific examples of ways in which they think post-colonial theory has actually done a lot more harm than it has helped. So This starts on page 86 with more egregiously still. So they say, more egregiously still, post-colonial theory with its disparagement of science and reason as provincial Western ways of knowing not only threatens the foundation of advanced contemporary societies, but also impedes the progress of developing ones. So maybe they meant to say it threatens to impede the progress, but this sounds like a claim that post-colonial theory has actually, in the real world, impeded the progress of developing societies. That's an empirical claim. No evidence here is given for it. Then the next paragraph, great practical harm is also done by post-colonialism's cultural relativism, which is found in both its scholarship and activism. It believes that the West, having trampled other cultures and enforced alien moral frameworks on them, must now cease to criticize, or in some cases, help more directly, any aspect of those cultures. This results in great ethical inconsistency in human rights activism with serious real-world consequences. So they're going to give us an example. For example, when feminists from Saudi Arabia, secular liberals from Pakistan, and LGBT rights activists from Uganda have attempted to raise the support of the English-speaking world by using hashtags in English on social media to draw attention to human rights abuses, they have received little response from the applied postmodern scholars and activists who might So here the problem is there are accusations of great practical harm being done by the cultural relativism of post-colonial theory. And this great practical harm here is not enough Twitter attention from post-colonial theorists, I guess. And then they say this may seem baffling or hypocritical, but it makes sense within a theoretical framework that does not operate according to universal principles of human rights, but believes in binary systems of power, which allow only for the Western oppressor and Eastern or globally Southern oppressed. Now, this results in two common claims. Well, if they're common, hopefully you can just give us plenty of examples and citations, right? First, post-colonial theory insists that getting a non-Western culture to accept that there are human rights abuses taking place locally requires colonizing that culture with Western notions of human rights and their violation. Okay, it's such a common claim, just give me one example, but no example given. Second,
Good job,
post-colonial theory...
We'll come back to that another time.
Second, post-colonial theory frequently claims that any human rights abuses occurring in previously colonized countries are the legacy of colonialism, and its analysis stops there. So I haven't seen anything from their analysis that suggests that post-colonial theorists think everything that goes wrong in a previously colonized society can be traced back to the colonialization itself.
What about the
I
grooming
can
gangs
imagine
in
that there are
England?
people who think this.
What about the grooming gangs in England and the response to that? I mean, I think that's a pretty good example.
I'm not familiar with that story.
That's a good one to look up, but yes.
I mean, there's they have a serious problem with grooming gangs, and they're Muslims, and they're like fucking with these young girls, and there's all sorts of evidence to it, and the administration would rather not respond to it because they're more nervous about the backlash.
So I just posted it in general one text. It's known as the Rotherham child sexual exploitation scandal. But in general, yeah, in the UK, it was seen as problematic were they to critique the British Pakistani men who had been conducting like sort of a sexual abuse ring in England. So for years, the authorities covered it up because it would be seen as racist.
They were told to cover it up. They were told to cover it up. They were instructed not to do anything
Seems
about
like
it.
a good example of a problematic view, right? Like this. Sorry,
I think some of these things are things that they consider self-evident, given if you've been paying attention to the news, like saying like Orange Man bad, Trump makes deranged statements. Do you need to like provide a quote? Like that Trump says unhinged things on Twitter.
I would link to one article. I would link to one article or one tweet at minimum.
I guess.
Right?
I guess.
No, I don't think you did link to one tweet.
Are they really that comparable? Are they really that comparable? Saying that Trump makes deranged statements and saying that post-colonial theory has been actively harmful.
To me, yes. To me, I mean, I read that.
This academic theory, right, from the academy had these crazy, horribly harmful practical consequences.
The
Yeah,
lack
I think you're right. There's a number of other connections they need to make because a lot of it has to do with the propagation of sort of like multiculturalism as an ideology and sort of the
Yeah,
cultural
yeah.
relativism that comes along with that, and how is that perpetuated by post-colonial theory? And yeah, it's a bigger project. So I agree.
Jesus, Reed is killing me in the comments. Sorry.
What is he saying in the comments? Are they addressing my critiques?
No. It's
Oh, no.
Yeah.
It is funny.
Oh,
though.
geez.
I'll put it up.
Okay. So then we have that claim. Then on page 87, we say that post-colonial theory frequently claims any human rights abuses. Right. So I haven't seen any of this in the scholarship that they're citing. Maybe this is a common claim among activists who embrace post-colonial theory. That's a plausible claim, but I don't see any justification for it here. Then they say, so they give an example. For instance, the widespread abuse of women, secularists, and LGBT people in strict Islamist cultures is not taken as a feature of authoritarian interpretations of Islam, as the Islamists themselves claim, but interpreted as a result of Western colonialism and imperialism, which perverted that culture and caused it to become abusive. So
Yeah,
I would
that
just like
needs a
to see any evidence. The next paragraph.
I can't help it.
This
I read
arises
it,
from first assuming.
I read these things and I'm like, yeah, yep. I mean, I can't.
I mean, I've seen videos of some things that do back their claims, which is like, I don't know if you've seen the videos of the Islam, the preachers who are in Northern Europe. They're like in Norway and they're preaching and they're saying the people who say that Islam is a religion of peace and that it's nonviolent and that Islam is a feminist religion, these people are Islamophobic. They're not willing to talk about what Islam actually is. So like, it's kind of like you have to already be familiar with this to like accept this claim. But I agree, like it needs a citation that there are post-colonial scholars who say that all those things where Islam is sort of nasty to women, gays, and and secularists, that's because of colonialism.
It might need a citation, but I
think
don't
it's out
see
there,
anything
but-
wrong with it. I mean, I don't see anything incorrect about what
Well, if
they
it's correct,
they're
then
claiming
give
that
us a
scholars say
citation.
that. Yeah, they're claiming that scholars say that.
Yeah.
Well, the scholars haven't,
And then they say,
haven't said
here's
anything
another
in
one.
response
The next
to
paragraph. The next paragraph. Okay, after they talk about this arises from first assuming the cause of a phenomenon and then looking for evidence of that cause. I think that there's evidence that, I mean, that's kind of like what we just like intuitively do as human beings. It's not a good way to do science, but it's sort of inevitable. The next paragraph after that, though, because they view knowledge and ethics as cultural constructs perpetuated in language, post-colonial theorists can be extremely difficult to discuss disagreements with. This is funny. Didn't they just claim that we shouldn't first assume causes? And now they're saying because this. Post-colonial theorists can be extremely difficult to discuss disagreements with. Evidenced and reasoned arguments are understood theoretically, capital T, as Western constructs and are therefore considered invalid or even oppressive. So please, just one scholar who has claimed that valid arguments are oppressive. Those who disagree with post-colonial theory are seen as confirming the theory, capital T, and as defending racist, colonialist, or imperialist attitudes for their own benefit and to shut out the viewpoints of others. Once again, just need to see some evidence for this claim. Finally, they say, this scholarship, which proceeds on the assumption that there are power imbalances to be discovered if language and interactions are deconstructed, cannot help but find increasing examples of othering, Orientalism, and appropriation in ever more tendentious ways. This is not a bug, but a feature. It is what the critical approach in theory means. This sounds just like their interpretation. I haven't seen evidence to suggest that like the critical in critical theory means that like it's never done. I've heard Robin DiAngelo say this kind of thing, that like we're never done investigating our own whiteness and internalized white supremacy. But Robin DiAngelo should not be taken as like evidence for what the critical in critical theory means.
Well, Well,
And then the last paragraph that finishes the 8-paragraph string is that this problem should not be underestimated. We can only learn from the realities of colonialism and its aftermath by studying them rigorously. And so they end with those post-colonial scholars and activists who deny the attainability of objective reality and seek to revise history along theoretical lines are not doing this. Neither are those, the implication is post-colonial scholars and activists, who reject logical reasoning, evidence-based research, science, and medicine, nor those who argue that space and time themselves are Western constructs. Again, this was not the claim. Nor those who write incomprehensible obfuscatory prose and deny that language can have meaning anyway. So it seems to me like these people are just very pissed off at post-colonial scholars and activists, which, I mean, given their, if the facts were as they presented them, understandable that they'd be just extremely pissed off. But the only evidence that they actually produced for post-colonial scholarship being sort of way out of left field and crazy, in my view, was the couple of scholars who discussed research justice and actually clearly, explicitly advocated research justice, where research justice means sort of putting intuition and sacred knowledge and spiritual practices on a level playing field with scientific observation.
Doesn't that seem to suggest that that's a valid way to interpret some of those previous quotes, though? That those authors who consider themselves in the post-colonial trend are coming up with that idea and stating it explicitly?
Well, it depends, right? So if the for instance, the essay that I was pushing back on Pluckrose and Lindsay's interpretation of, I was trying to defend by Maldonado Torres et al., these people are actually discussing philosophers in the Western tradition, and they see themselves as doing philosophy, right? The scholars who are doing research justice, I'm not sure what academic disciplines they would call home, but I'm pretty sure one of them was like a professor of Native American studies, and the other, I don't remember being able to find what exactly like academic department they were in. And I think post-colonial theory, I actually don't think that Maldonado Torres himself would even call himself a post-colonial theorist. There has been like an intentional rebranding that some theorists have explicitly chosen as decolonial because of rather than post-colonial. And so, I mean, it's an open question as to whether Maldonado Torres would see himself as aligned with the kind of person who advocated research justice. I think the name was Joe Levet. But grouping them together in the same chapter doesn't mean that they can that it's reasonable to group them together in the same chapter.
Do you think that Robin DiAngelo considers herself a post-colonialist? Whether she is considered
No,
you don't think she considers herself a post-colonialist?
No, a post-colonialist or a post-colonial theorist? I don't think so. I think she would say, I am a critical whiteness theorist. The discipline, I mean, she's technically in education. Her PhD's in multicultural education, but she's broadly within the tradition of, it's called critical whiteness studies.
Okay. So she makes no arguments about colonization or decolonizing?
Well, she might in works I haven't read, but I haven't. But in White Fragility, I mean...
she says her area of research is in whiteness studies and critical discourse analysis. I take that critical discourse analysis to be like specifically a reference to Foucault.
The question I have is I feel like if somebody claiming to be a scientist had a book that was as popular as White Fragility, or just the things happening in the news that nothing is being responded to. If that happened, all the scientists would write a letter. Like they'd all sign a letter saying, this is not science. And I don't see that happening in these fields, which is, to me, it's like, why shouldn't I consider this to be true? I mean, you have to have boundaries, otherwise they do get to be grouped into what.
Well, I think it's because with post-colonial theory, there's no discipline, right? I mean, unless there is that I'm not aware of. But post-colonial theory was first most popular in English departments and literature departments in the 80s and 90s. And it's a sort of lens for theorizing certain phenomena and certain.
Okay, but you know the
It's
popularity.
a sort of lens one can take on.
But you know the popularity of using those words, like calling people colonizers and talking about it being some sort of internalized colonizer perspective. If there is a legitimate perspective that you're describing that the actual academics have, why have they not come out and said that's not us, that's something else? I mean, it just seems really disingenuous to me. If I know about it, you must know about it. So why aren't you coming out and saying something about it?
I mean,
distinguish
actually, I think some of them have. I mean, Spivak herself has come out and said, according to Wikipedia and my brief research that I did earlier today, that Spivak came out and denounced popular usage of strategic essentialism
That's good.
as basically misinformed, and people didn't know what she was actually talking about. I mean, Foucault, towards the end of his life, was very involved in sort of making pronouncements about how people had misunderstood him. Kimberly Crenshaw has said that intersectionality was misinterpreted, and the way that it's used today was not at all aligned with the way that she intended it to be used. So, I mean, there are examples of these people doing these things. I think why do we not know about that? Well, because unless you actually research it, you probably don't know about post-colonial theory itself, unless, like Eric, you did a literature degree and you were sort of forced to engage with these kinds of things.
Yeah, I don't know. It just seems like a perfect place to have an open letter for these people to sign and say, like, this is not. Just have something easy to point to. Say, this is what post-colonialism is, and that is not. I think that these fields are very hesitant to ever do anything like that. That's the way.
Yeah.
Well, again, they're not like fields.
Well, to me, that's the postmodern.
Like, there's no department of post-colonial.
Then how can you criticize this take on it?
Well, you find the scholars who say, look, I'm a post-colonialist, or like, I'm doing post-colonial theory, within history or within literature or within sociology or whatever it is. There are a lot of anthropologists who find this an attractive lens, and you critique those scholars, right? And you critique.
Again, I'm not an expert, and maybe I just don't know about this, but every time I've tried to read these things, one, I can't read them. They're fucking annoying to read. And two,
right.
Two, they seem like completely resistant to establishing boundaries over what it is they're talking about, what is considered valid and what isn't considered valid, as far as fitting underneath this concept. Like in science, it's easy. It's easy. It is. It's the scientific method. It's empiricism. It's like, if you're not doing that, it's not science, and you don't get to call it science. But I feel like these fields would really benefit from that kind of a thing. Just establish what it is and what it isn't.
You don't even know about the debates going on in philosophy of science. Come on, man. Like, there's plenty of fights over that, buddy.
It's not easy, right? Yeah. I mean, this was another critique I had in the chapter I didn't read, where they say something about, like, in science, there's a clear criterion. It's empirical adequacy. And I was like, oh, this is a very one-dimensional way to look at science. But yeah, I should go because it's my brother's birthday and we're going to have dinner. Thanks everyone for participating and hopefully we'll have an enlightening conversation about queer theory and what's the next one? Critical race theory and intersectionality. Shit, I suspect I'll have nothing to say about the queer theory chapter, but we'll
Really?
see.
I was gonna
I
try
don't
to
know,
find
man.
examples
I'm-
of things
'cause
that I
I'm-
think are obvious.
I'm not gonna read Butler. Like, I'm not gonna read Butler. So,
Okay. Cool. Well,
all right, everyone,
this was
take
good.
care.
See you, man.
Yep. See you later. Thanks for watching, everybody who watched.